In the soft shadows of ancient history, there exists a tale of unparalleled conquest and ambition, a story that unfolds across the vast tapestry of the ancient world, from the rugged mountains of Macedonia to the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, from the opulent palaces of Persia to the mysterious frontiers of India. This is the story of Alexander the Great. The name Alexander echoes through the corridors of time, reverberating across more than 2 millennia. Born a prince in the northern reaches of the Greek world, this extraordinary figure created one of history's most vast empires before his flame was extinguished at the mere age of 32. His life burns bright in historical memory, a brilliant comet that blazed across the ancient sky, forever altering the lands beneath. The landscapes of Alexander's world still whisper his legend, the windswept hills of Macedonia, where he first learned to command, the scholars' gardens of Athens, where wisdom was imparted, the flowing rivers of mighty Persia, where empires clashed, and the exotic beauty of India's horizons, where his ambitions finally found their limit. His is not merely a chronicle of conquest, but a complex tapestry of human ambition, strategic brilliance, personal contradiction, and perhaps, ultimately, the boundaries that confine even those who seem destined for limitless greatness. In Alexander's story lies the eternal paradox of human achievement, how one life, however briefly lived, can forever alter the course of civilization. The stage was set in the kingdom of Macedonia, where the ambitious King Philip II had transformed a marginal Greek state into a formidable power. There, amid court intrigue and military innovation, the foundations were being laid for the arrival of history's most legendary conqueror. Ancient Macedonia occupied a unique position in the Greek world, neither fully embraced as truly Hellenic, nor entirely dismissed as barbarian. Its rugged terrain and harsh climate forged a people of remarkable resilience, skilled horsemen and warriors who lived on the periphery of the more sophisticated Greek city-states to the south. The Macedonians spoke their own dialect, worshipped similar gods with different rituals, and maintained traditions that seemed rustic to their southern neighbors. This northern kingdom might have remained a footnote in history were it not for the ascension of an extraordinary ruler, Philip II. His path to power began in the most unlikely circumstances. As a young man, Philip was taken hostage to Thebes, one of Greece's leading city-states. What might have been a humiliation became instead a profound education. In Thebes, Philip observed the brilliant military innovations of the Theban general Epaminondas, who had revolutionized warfare with new tactics and formations. Upon returning to Macedonia in the 4th century, Philip found a kingdom in disarray, threatened by hostile neighbors and internal strife. His brother Perdiccas III had fallen in battle against the Illyrians, leaving behind an infant heir. Seizing the moment, Philip first acted as regent before claiming the throne for himself. The new king faced rebellious nobles, aggressive tribal neighbors, and Greek city-states eager to exploit Macedonian weakness. What followed was a masterclass in both diplomacy and warfare. Philip reorganized the Macedonian army, transforming it into a professional fighting force unlike anything the Greek world had seen. At the heart of this revolution was the sarissa, a pike nearly 18 feet long that allowed the Macedonian phalanx to present a deadly wall of spear points, extending well beyond the reach of traditional Greek hoplite spears. Philip supplemented this formidable infantry with the finest cavalry in Greece, drawn from the nobility of Macedonia's highlands. This combined arms approach created a military machine capable of dominating any battlefield. Yet Philip was equally adept at statecraft, employing strategic marriages, bribery, and diplomacy to divide his enemies and expand Macedonian influence. The Greece that Philip sought to dominate was far removed from its golden age. The devastating Peloponnesian War had ended Athenian supremacy, while Sparta's subsequent hegemony proved short-lived. The brief Theban ascendancy under Epaminondas collapsed with his death. By Philip's time, the Greek world consisted of exhausted, quarreling city-states, their treasuries depleted, and their populations weary of endless conflict. Looming behind these Greek struggles was the vast Persian Empire to the east. Since Xerxes' failed invasion a century earlier, Persia had remained the dominant power in Asia Minor, occasionally intervening in Greek affairs. With its seemingly limitless wealth, Greek mercenaries regularly served the Persian king, and Greek cities in Asia Minor remained under Persian control. The dream of avenging Xerxes' invasion and liberating these Greek cities had persisted for generations, though no Greek state possessed the resources to challenge Persian might. Philip's Macedonia grew stronger year by year. Through a combination of military victories and shrewd alliances, he secured his kingdom's borders and began expanding southward. The conquest of the gold mines at Mount Pangaion provided the wealth to fund his ambitions. One by one, the northern Greek states fell under Macedonian influence or direct control. Athens, once the jewel of Greek civilization, now found itself threatened by Macedonian power. The great orator Demosthenes thundered warnings about Philip's ambitions, delivering his famous Philippics to rouse Athenian resistance. Other voices, like the orator Isocrates, suggested that Philip might be the leader Greece needed to unite against Persia. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip's forces, including his teenage son Alexander, crushed the combined armies of Athens and Thebes. This victory established Macedonian hegemony over mainland Greece. Philip then organized the League of Corinth, a confederation of Greek states under his leadership, and announced his intention to invade Persia. On the eve of this great expedition, at the wedding feast of his daughter Cleopatra, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. The motives behind this assassination remain debated by historians. A personal grudge, a conspiracy involving foreign powers, or perhaps the machinations of Philip's own wife Olympias, who feared her son Alexander might be displaced in the succession. Whatever the truth, Philip's death marked the end of one remarkable reign and the beginning of another even more extraordinary. The stage was set for Alexander, barely 20 years old, to inherit both a kingdom at the height of its power and his father's grand ambition to conquer the Persian Empire. The world would never be the same. In the ancient capital of Pella, as summer reached its zenith, a child was born who would one day reach beyond the borders of the known world. The year was 356, and as the infant Alexander drew his first breath, messengers rushed to King Philip with extraordinary news. The Macedonian general Parmenion had won a significant victory against the Illyrians. Philip's prized racehorse had won at the Olympic Games, and his wife Olympias had delivered a healthy son. Such auspicious omens seemed to herald the arrival of someone destined for greatness. The royal couple who produced this remarkable child could not have been more different from one another. Philip was pragmatic, calculating, a master of both battlefield and negotiating table. Olympias came from the wild mountains of Epirus to the west, a princess of the Molossian royal house who traced her lineage back to the hero Achilles. Rumors swirled around the queen that she kept serpents as pets, that she participated in mysterious ecstatic religious rites dedicated to Dionysus, that she possessed powers beyond mortal ken. Olympias herself encouraged the whispers that her son's true father was not Philip, but Zeus himself, king of the gods. She told Alexander he was conceived during a thunderstorm when lightning struck the palace and her womb. Throughout his life, Alexander embraced both his alleged divine parentage and his claimed descent from Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War. These beliefs would shape his self-image and, consequently, the fate of nations. The young prince grew surrounded by the trappings of power in the Macedonian court. Unlike the austere military culture of Sparta or the philosophical schools of Athens, Pella was a place where Eastern luxury mingled with Greek refinement and frontier ruggedness. Here, Alexander first witnessed the elaborate court ceremonies, diplomatic negotiations, and political maneuverings that would later inform his own leadership style. Even as a child, Alexander displayed the exceptional qualities that would later define him. Tales of his precocious intelligence and boldness delighted the court. When Persian ambassadors visited Pella during Philip's absence, the young prince astounded them with his mature questions about Persian roads, military forces, and the character of their king. Already, his mind turned toward the east. Perhaps the most famous story of Alexander's youth concerns the taming of Bucephalus, a magnificent but seemingly untamable horse. Observers noticed the animal was afraid of its own shadow. Where experienced horsemen had failed, the 12-year-old Alexander succeeded by turning the horse toward the sun, eliminating the shadow that had frightened it. Impressed by his son's perception and courage, Philip reportedly said, "My boy, seek a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." This story, whether embellished or not, captures something essential about Alexander: his ability to see what others missed, to approach problems from unexpected angles, and to act with decisive boldness. Bucephalus would remain his faithful companion through battles and across continents, carrying him to the edges of the known world. Alexander's childhood was not without shadows. His father's numerous marriages, diplomatic unions that secured alliances with neighboring kingdoms, created a complex web of half-siblings and potential rivals. Philip's frequent absences on military campaigns meant that Olympias exerted considerable influence over her son's early development. The fierce loyalty between mother and son would endure throughout Alexander's life, sometimes with devastating consequences for those who earned their enmity. Court life in Pella exposed the young prince to a cosmopolitan mix of ideas, peoples, and cultures. Macedonia's position as a frontier kingdom meant that Greek sophistication coexisted with the traditions of Thracian and Illyrian tribes. This early exposure to cultural diversity perhaps planted the seeds for Alexander's later vision of a world where Greek and barbarian could share power and respect. As he approached adolescence, Alexander had already absorbed the heroic tales from Homer's epics, learned the fundamentals of rhetoric and statecraft, and begun his training in the arts of war. Yet Philip, recognizing his son's exceptional intellect, sought a teacher who could provide an education worthy of a future king. His choice would alter not only Alexander's development, but the intellectual history of the world. When the young prince reached his 13th year, Philip made an extraordinary decision. For his son's education, he would secure the services of Aristotle, a former student of Plato and already recognized as one of the greatest minds in the Greek world. The philosopher, then in his 40s, had studied at Plato's academy in Athens, but had developed his own distinct approach to understanding the cosmos, politics, ethics, and the natural world. The king established a dedicated school at Mieza, a sanctuary of the nymphs, with shaded walkways and flowing springs. Here, in this secluded setting, away from the distractions of court life, the young Macedonian and a select group of noble youths would receive an education unprecedented in its breadth and depth. Many of these companions, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Cassander, Nearchus, and others, would later serve as generals and administrators, forming the nucleus of his empire-building machine. Under the plane trees of Mieza, Aristotle unfolded the world for his students. The philosopher's interests were encyclopedic, ranging from biology and astronomy to poetry and political theory. He taught the prince to observe nature with precision, to analyze arguments with logic, and to appreciate the beauty of well-crafted verse. The young heir learned botany, zoology, medicine, mathematics, and the principles of rhetoric that would serve him well in rallying troops and negotiating with foreign powers. Most significantly, Aristotle introduced his royal pupil to systematic political thought. The philosopher was developing his comparative studies of constitutions and his theories about the ideal forms of government. These lessons gave the future conqueror a framework for understanding the diverse political systems he would encounter and ultimately reshape across 3 continents. The young Macedonian displayed a particular passion for literature, especially Homer's Iliad. The epic poem, with its tales of heroism, honor, and glory, won on distant battlefields, captured his imagination completely. Aristotle prepared a special annotated copy of the text, which the prince would carry throughout his campaigns, sleeping with it beneath his pillow alongside his dagger. From Achilles, his purported ancestor, the youth drew inspiration for a life lived brilliantly, even if brief. While absorbing Aristotle's teachings, Philip's son also maintained his physical training. A Macedonian prince needed to be as capable in combat as in conversation. He excelled in wrestling, running, and horsemanship, developing the physical prowess that would later enable him to fight alongside his men in the front ranks of battle. A distinctive leadership style that inspired fanatical loyalty. The relationship between Aristotle and his royal student was complex. The philosopher instilled in his pupil an appreciation for Greek culture and a belief in Greek superiority over non-Greeks, whom Aristotle considered natural slaves. Yet the young man would eventually develop his own more inclusive vision, incorporating Persians and other conquered peoples into his administration, a policy that would later cause tension with his Macedonian veterans. Aristotle's influence extended beyond politics and ethics to the prince's lifelong curiosity about the natural world. During his later campaigns, the conqueror would send specimens of unknown plants and animals back to his former teacher, contributing to the development of natural history. This intellectual aspect of his conquests is often overshadowed by military achievements, but represents a significant legacy in its own right. After approximately 3 years at Mieza, the formal education under Aristotle concluded. The 16-year-old heir returned to Pella, intellectually armed with some of the most advanced thinking of his age. While he would sometimes reject or transcend Aristotle's more parochial views, the philosophical training received provided essential conceptual tools for his unprecedented project of empire building and cultural fusion. The seeds planted at Mieza would bear fruit throughout the young ruler's brief but momentous life. His vision of bringing Greek civilization to the barbarian world, while simultaneously incorporating elements of Eastern cultures, reflected both an extension of and departure from his teacher's worldview. Similarly, his practice of bringing scientists, historians, and philosophers on his campaigns demonstrated the value he placed on knowledge alongside conquest. The future king had been shaped by extraordinary influences: a father who revolutionized warfare, a mother who claimed divine connections, and a teacher who systematized human knowledge. Now, events would soon thrust the youth from the world of learning into the crucible of power and war. The transformation from student to warrior prince came swiftly. While still absorbing Aristotle's teachings, the 16-year-old received his first taste of independent command. Philip, campaigning against the Byzantines, entrusted his son with governing Macedonia in his absence, a profound vote of confidence in the young prince's abilities. The royal heir did not disappoint. When the Maedi, a Thracian tribe, rebelled against Macedonian authority, he responded with decisive action. Gathering a force of experienced soldiers and young nobles, the teenage regent marched against the rebels. His campaign combined his father's innovative tactics with his own bold instincts. The Maedi, expecting perhaps tentative leadership from such a young commander, instead faced a resolute leader who crushed their uprising and established a new city, Alexandropolis, on their territory. This first independent military success foreshadowed the extraordinary campaigns to come. 2 years later came the defining battle of Philip's reign, Cheronea, where Macedonian forces faced the combined armies of Athens and Thebes. Here the young warrior received his true initiation into warfare on a grand scale. Philip assigned his 18-year-old son command of the left wing, which included the elite companion cavalry, a position of tremendous responsibility and trust. As the battle unfolded, the prince seized a critical moment. Seeing a gap appear in the Theban lines as they advanced, he led his cavalry in a decisive charge that broke through the sacred band, Thebes' elite force of 300 warriors who had never before been defeated. This successful cavalry assault proved crucial to the Macedonian victory that day, establishing Philip's dominance over southern Greece. The young commander's performance at Cheronea demonstrated not only physical courage, but tactical intelligence. He had internalized his father's military innovations while adding his own aggressive instincts. Philip, always the pragmatic commander, combined careful preparation with opportunistic flexibility. His son embraced these lessons, but already showed signs of the more dramatic, risk-taking approach that would characterize his later campaigns. Following the triumph at Cheronea, tensions emerged between father and son. Philip's latest marriage to a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice created both personal and political complications. At the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle Attalus offered a toast hoping for a legitimate heir to the throne, an insult implying that Olympias's son, born of a foreign mother, was somehow illegitimate. Enraged by this slight, the prince hurled his drinking cup at Attalus, triggering a confrontation that ended with Philip drawing his sword against his own son. Though the king, intoxicated, stumbled and fell before violence could occur, the damage was done. Taking his mother with him, the young heir fled Macedonia for the kingdom of Epirus, Olympias' homeland. The exile proved brief. Through diplomatic intermediaries, father and son achieved a fragile reconciliation, allowing the prince to return to court. However, suspicions and resentments lingered on both sides. Philip sent his reconciled son on a diplomatic mission to Athens, where the young negotiator displayed unexpected skill in dealing with a city that had so recently fought against Macedonia. Political intrigue intensified as Philip prepared for his long-planned invasion of Persia. Questions about succession became increasingly significant as the king contemplated a campaign that might keep him away from Macedonia for years. The birth of a son to Cleopatra Eurydice complicated matters further, giving Philip a fully Macedonian heir who might be preferred by nationalistic nobles. In this atmosphere of tension and uncertainty, events took a dramatic turn at the wedding of Philip's daughter, Cleopatra, to Alexander of Epirus. During the celebratory procession, as Philip walked unguarded between his son and his new son-in-law, A bodyguard named Pausanias rushed forward and stabbed the king to death. The assassin attempted to escape, but was caught and killed by pursuing guards before he could be questioned. The motivations behind this assassination have been debated ever since. Some ancient sources suggest Pausanias acted from personal grievance after suffering an insult from Attalus that Philip had failed to punish adequately. Others point to Persian gold, suggesting the great king sought to eliminate the threat of invasion by removing Macedonia's ruler. Most provocative are hints that Olympias, her son, or both, might have been complicit in the plot, eliminating Philip before he could set aside his troublesome wife and possibly disinherit his ambitious heir. Whatever the truth, the prince moved swiftly to secure power. As Philip's body lay in the dust, Macedonia stood at a crossroads, with enemies both within and beyond its borders, poised to exploit any sign of weakness. The 20-year-old successor, shaped by his father's military genius and his teacher's philosophical wisdom, now faced the supreme test of leadership. The world held its breath to see whether the new ruler would collapse under the weight of his inheritance, or transform it into something even greater than Philip had envisioned. Throughout history, great leaders have been defined not only by their public achievements, but by their private bonds. For the young Macedonian ruler, certain relationships formed the emotional core around which his extraordinary life revolved. First among these was his connection with Hephaestion, a bond so profound that it would endure from boyhood until death. They had met as students under Aristotle at Mieza, where their friendship blossomed amid philosophical discussions and athletic competitions. Tall, handsome, and intelligent, Hephaestion became the conqueror's closest confidant, the one person before whom the prince could lower his guard completely. Ancient sources, including Arrian and Plutarch, compared their relationship to that of Achilles and Patroclus from Homer's Iliad. High praise indeed for the young ruler who modelled himself after the legendary warrior. The precise nature of their bond has been debated across centuries. In the context of ancient Greek culture, close emotional and physical relationships between men were not viewed through the restrictive lens of later eras. What matters is not the modern categorization of their connection, but its profound influence on the king's life. Hephaestion served as alter ego, trusted general, diplomatic envoy, an emotional anchor for a monarch whose position otherwise isolated him from genuine human connection. Unlike other companions who sometimes challenged their leader's decisions or ambitions, Hephaestion aligned himself completely with his friend's vision. "You are Alexander. I am Hephaestion," he reportedly said when mistaken for the king, expressing both their physical resemblance and his acceptance of his supporting role in their shared story. This unwavering loyalty made him invaluable in an environment rife with jealousy and political maneuvering. Second, only to Hephaestion in emotional importance, was Olympias, whose influence shaped her son from his earliest moments. Their relationship defied simple description, intense, sometimes problematic, but foundational to the prince's sense of self. This formidable woman instilled in her offspring the belief in his extraordinary destiny, nurturing the ambition that would drive him across continents. Fiercely protective and politically astute, Olympias operated as a power in her own right within the Macedonian court. During her son's campaigns in Asia, she maintained her position in Macedonia, sometimes clashing with Antipater, the general left to govern in the monarch's absence. Her letters, filled with court gossip and maternal advice, linked the distant ruler to home, even as he ventured into unknown lands. The shadow side of Olympia's devotion was her ruthlessness toward perceived threats to her son's position. When Philip's last wife, Cleopatra, Eurydice, gave birth to a potential rival heir. Olympias allegedly arranged the murder of both mother and infant after Philip's assassination. The young king may not have sanctioned these brutal acts, but he benefited from his mother's elimination of potential challengers. Among the inner circle, Ptolemy occupied a unique position. Slightly older than the Macedonian leader, and possibly his half-brother through Philip, Ptolemy combined loyalty with intellectual independence. A capable commander and shrewd political operator, he kept detailed journals throughout the campaigns that later became valuable historical sources. After his commander's death, Ptolemy would establish himself as ruler of Egypt, founding a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra VII 3 centuries later. Craterus, described as the king's friend, represented the traditional Macedonian values within the inner circle. Beloved by the common soldiers for his straightforward manner and fighting prowess, he provided a critical link between the royal commander and his sometimes restive Macedonian veterans. The sovereign trusted him with increasingly important commands, recognizing his tactical ability and leadership qualities. Perdiccas, initially just one among many noble companions, rose through loyalty and competence to become one of the most trusted generals. By the later stages of the campaign, he had been elevated to the prestigious position of commander of the companion cavalry. The dying king's gesture of handing his royal signet ring to Perdiccas would later be interpreted as designating him regent, with momentous consequences for the empire's future. Bagoas, a Persian eunuch of remarkable beauty who had previously been a favorite of King Darius III, entered the imperial entourage after the conquest of Persia. Ancient sources suggest he became an intimate companion of the Macedonian ruler, symbolizing perhaps the growing embrace of Persian customs and the vision of cultural fusion. During a festival at Opis, the great conqueror publicly kissed Bagoas after he won a dance competition, demonstrating both personal affection and cultural openness that shocked traditional Macedonians. Not all significant relationships were harmonious. Parmenion, Philip's most trusted general, represented an older generation of Macedonian leadership. Though loyal and experienced, he often counseled caution when his young sovereign preferred boldness. This tension came to a tragic conclusion when Parmenion's son, Philotas, was implicated in a conspiracy. Both father and son would pay with their lives in an episode that revealed the darker aspects of the king's character. Clytus the Black, who had saved the young commander's life at the Granicus River, met a tragic end at the royal hand during a drunken quarrel. The incident represented the dangerous volatility that sometimes erupted through the ruler's cultivated exterior, particularly when his self-image or divine pretensions were challenged. These personal connections, from the steadfast devotion of Hephaestion to the complicated maternal influence of Olympias, to the tragically fractured friendships with once trusted companions, provide essential context for understanding the decisions, motivations, and emotional development throughout this remarkable career. Behind the conquests and the glory stood a man defined, like all humans, by the people he loved, trusted, and sometimes betrayed. The ascension, following Philip's assassination, unfolded with the speed and decisiveness that would characterize the entire reign. As the clamor of confusion and alarm spread through the palace at Ege, the 20-year-old prince moved with calculated precision to secure his position. Within hours, he had rallied the loyal companions, addressed the army as their new leader, and ordered the arrest of potential rivals to the throne. The situation demanded such decisiveness. Macedonia faced threats on multiple fronts: restive Greek city-states to the south, tribal kingdoms to the north and west, and internal factions that might prefer different claimants to Philip's throne. The assassination created a dangerous power vacuum that the young heir filled before others could organize opposition. His first challenge came from within the Macedonian nobility. His cousin Amyntas, son of Philip's brother Perdiccas, had a strong claim to the throne by blood. Despite having been passed over by Philip in favor of his son, Amyntas represented a potential rallying point for discontented factions. The new ruler ordered his execution, along with other relatives who might become focal points for opposition. This ruthless elimination of potential rivals revealed the pragmatic, sometimes brutal side of the young monarch's character, a willingness to secure power through bloodshed when necessary. Meanwhile, the prince moved to reconcile with influential nobles who had been aligned with his father. He confirmed Antipater and Parmenion in their positions of authority, recognizing their experience and the loyalty commands inspired in the army. With characteristic rhetorical skill, he addressed the assembled Macedonian troops, promising to continue Philip's planned campaign against Persia while surpassing his father's achievements. Beyond Macedonia's borders, news of Philip's death sparked immediate rebellions. The Greek cities, chafing under Macedonian dominance, saw an opportunity to regain independence. Thebes, Athens, and other states began negotiations to form an anti-Macedonian coalition. To the north, Thracian tribes and Illyrian kingdoms mobilized to reclaim territories Philip had conquered. The young king's response demonstrated the lightning-fast decision-making and physical endurance that would become his hallmarks. Rather than allowing the separate threats to coalesce, he struck with overwhelming force against each in turn. Leading the army south with astonishing speed, he arrived in Thessaly before the Greek cities had expected him to even receive news of their rebellious intentions. At the narrow pass of Tempe, Thessalian forces had gathered to block the Macedonian advance. Rather than engage in a potentially costly frontal assault, the resourceful commander found a rarely used mountain path, leading his men in a difficult ascent that allowed them to outflank the Thessalian position. Faced with Macedonian forces appearing where they thought no army could reach, the Thessalians surrendered without battle. This pattern, innovative problem-solving combined with audacious execution, would repeat throughout the coming campaigns. At Thebes, where resistance seemed most determined, the young monarch offered initially generous terms. When these were refused, he unleashed the full might of the Macedonian military machine. The resulting destruction of this ancient city sent shockwaves through the Greek world. Thebes paid a terrible price for its defiance. After defeating its forces in battle, the victorious king allowed his troops to sack the city. Buildings were razed, thousands of inhabitants sold into slavery, and only the house of the poet Pindar was spared out of respect for Greek cultural heritage. This calculated brutality served as a warning to other Greek states contemplating rebellion. Athens, previously vocal in opposing Macedonia, hastily sent ambassadors offering submission. With Greece subdued through this combination of lightning warfare and strategic terror, the Macedonian ruler turned north to secure his frontiers before embarking on the Persian campaign. In a single brilliant campaign of just 10 days, he defeated multiple tribal armies, marching his forces through mountainous terrain that enemies considered impassable. Once again, his ability to achieve the seemingly impossible created an aura of invincibility that demoralized opponents before battle was even joined. Having secured Macedonia's European borders, the young sovereign moved to consolidate his authority through a mixture of conciliation and intimidation. He convened the Corinthian League, the alliance of Greek states created by Philip, and had himself confirmed as its leader, with authority to wage war against Persia. While maintaining Macedonian military garrisons in strategic locations, He otherwise respected the autonomy of Greek cities that acknowledged his leadership. This delicate balance, maintaining control while minimizing active resistance, reflected remarkable political acumen. Unlike his father, who had spent decades gradually expanding Macedonian influence through painstaking diplomacy and incremental military pressure, the son achieved comparable results in little more than a year. His combination of overwhelming force, strategic insight, and calculated clemency created a relatively stable power base from which he could launch his eastern campaigns. The speed with which power was consolidated astonished contemporaries and has impressed historians ever since. In the space of 2 years, the prince had transformed himself from a somewhat controversial heir to an unquestioned ruler, ready to embark on the greatest military adventure the ancient world had yet seen. His father's planned invasion of Persia, originally conceived as a limited campaign to liberate Greek cities in Asia Minor, would become something far more ambitious in the son's hands. As spring arrived, preparations began to cross the Hellespont, with an army of approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Before departing, the young king distributed nearly all the royal lands and revenues to his friends and generals. When asked what he was keeping for himself, he replied, "Hope." This gesture, combining practical politics with theatrical flair, typified the monarch who now stood at the threshold between the familiar Greek world and the vast, mysterious empire to the east. The heir to Macedonia inherited from his father not merely a kingdom and an army, but a revolutionary approach to warfare. What made the Macedonian military system exceptional, and what would be refined to near perfection under new leadership, was its combination of specialized units integrated through disciplined coordination. Unlike the citizen soldiers of Greek city-states who fought as part-time warriors, Philip had created a professional fighting force with year-round training and specialized equipment. At the core of this system stood the Macedonian phalanx, a formation of infantry wielding the fearsome sarissa, a pike reaching between 16 and 18 feet in length. These weapons, nearly 3 times longer than the traditional Greek hoplite spear, created a deadly thicket of points that few opponents could penetrate. Soldiers trained extensively to maneuver these unwieldy weapons in unison, creating a bristling wall that could advance, wheel, or hold position with remarkable precision. The young commander recognized both the phalanx's tremendous strengths and its inherent limitations. While nearly impenetrable from the front, the formation lacked flexibility and became vulnerable if its cohesion was broken or its flanks exposed. Rather than relying solely on the phalanx's pushing power, as Greek warfare had traditionally emphasized, it was used as an anvil against which more mobile forces could hammer enemies. Those mobile forces centered on the companion cavalry, an elite unit of Macedonian nobles that the king himself commanded in battle. Riding without stirrups, which had not yet been invented, these horsemen carried shorter lances than modern cavalry, and fought in a wedge formation designed to punch through enemy lines. Their tactics were modified to emphasize explosive charges at critical moments, often targeting the location of enemy commanders. Between the ponderous phalanx and the swift cavalry operated the hypaspists, elite infantry equipped with shorter spears and more maneuverable formations. These troops could both protect the phalanx's vulnerable flanks and exploit gaps created by cavalry charges. This middle element provided crucial flexibility to the Macedonian system, bridging the operational divide between heavy infantry and mounted forces. Complementing these core elements were specialized units gathered from across the Hellenic world and beyond. Cretan archers, Thracian javelin throwers, Agrianian light infantry from the northern mountains, and Greek allied cavalry. Each provided capabilities that the Macedonian national forces lacked, creating a combined arms approach of remarkable sophistication. The military genius of Macedonia's ruler lay not in inventing new units, but in using familiar elements in innovative combinations. He developed a keen eye for terrain, positioning his forces to maximize their respective strengths while exploiting enemy weaknesses. Mountains, rivers, and plains became pieces on his mental chessboard, and troops were maneuvered with an intuitive understanding of how geography could multiply combat effectiveness. Perhaps most revolutionary was the approach to logistics, the unglamorous but essential science of keeping armies supplied on campaign. Previous Greek expeditions had often been limited by the need to bring supplies from home territories, or to campaign only in harvest seasons when food could be obtained locally. The Macedonian leader developed a sophisticated supply system that included carefully planned routes, supply depots, and coordination with naval forces. This logistical expertise enabled the unprecedented operational range and speed that characterized the coming campaigns. While Philip had operated mainly within the Balkan Peninsula, his son would lead armies across thousands of miles of diverse terrain, from Mediterranean coastlines to Mesopotamian river valleys and Central Asian mountains to Indian jungles. Such campaigns required not just fighting ability, but intricate planning for food, water, replacement weapons, and medical care. The royal commander also revolutionized siege warfare, an area where Greek armies had traditionally struggled. Previous sieges often devolved into simple blockades, waiting for hunger to force surrender. Under the new leadership, engineering corps developed sophisticated mining operations, siege towers of unprecedented height, and torsion-powered artillery that could batter stone walls. These technical innovations, combined with characteristic impatience and willingness to accept casualties, meant that cities that might have withstood years of blockade fell within weeks or months. The monarch's personal fighting style embodied the army's aggressive spirit. Unlike Persian kings who observed from safe distances, the Macedonian led from the front, fighting in the thickest combat alongside common soldiers. His conspicuous armor and white-plumed helmet made him easily identifiable on the battlefield, a deliberate choice that inspired his men while making him a target for enemy champions seeking glory. This leadership approach came with obvious risks. The young warrior sustained at least 8 serious wounds during his campaigns, several nearly fatal. Yet the psychological impact of seeing their king bleeding alongside them created fanatical loyalty among his troops. When he charged into an enemy formation, his men would follow, where more cautious commanders' soldiers might hesitate. Beyond technical and tactical innovations, the most significant military contribution may have been psychological. The supreme commander understood that armies are human systems driven by morale, perception, and cultural factors. By studying enemies' values and fears, he could target not just their physical formations, but their will to fight. Against Greeks, he emphasized overwhelming force. Against Persians, he attacked command structures. Against tribal peoples, he demonstrated both invincibility and clemency. This holistic approach to warfare, integrating technical, tactical, logistical, and psychological elements, created a military system of unprecedented effectiveness. As preparations began to test this system against the vast Persian Empire, few could have predicted just how devastating the results would be. The narrow strait of the Hellespont, where Europe and Asia nearly touch, has served as both bridge and barrier between civilizations for millennia. Here, where the distance between continents shrinks to less than a mile, the young Macedonian king prepared to cross with his army in the spring of his 3rd year as ruler. The magnitude of this undertaking can scarcely be overstated. The Persian Empire stretched from the Mediterranean to India, ruling millions of subjects and commanding resources that dwarfed those of Macedonia. The invasion began with characteristic attention to both practical preparation and symbolic gesture. As the main force gathered at the crossing point, the commander sailed ahead with a smaller contingent. Approaching the Asian shore, he hurled his spear into the soil, claiming the continent as Spear One territory, in a dramatic gesture that proclaimed his intention to conquer through force of arms. More poignant was the royal pilgrimage to the ruins of Troy, that legendary city whose fall had been immortalized in Homer's Iliad. At the purported tomb of Achilles, the conqueror performed sacrifices and ran naked around the monument to honor his claimed ancestor. He and Hephaestion laid wreaths at the tombs of Achilles and Patroclus respectively, underscoring their own parallel relationship. From the temple of Athena, he took an ancient shield said to date from the Trojan War, which would accompany him on his campaigns. These symbolic acts revealed the Macedonian's deep connection to mythic heroism and his desire to frame the invasion as a continuation of ancient Greek struggles against Asia. Yet unlike Agamemnon and Achilles before him, he crossed into Asia with remarkably limited forces. His army numbered approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, a small force to challenge an empire that could field hundreds of thousands of troops. The initial Persian response proved surprisingly disorganized. Rather than concentrating their vastly superior numbers, Persian satraps, provincial governors, gathered separate forces that divided their potential strength. At the Granicus River, not far from Troy, the invading army encountered its first major Persian opposition, a force of approximately 20,000 infantry and similar numbers of cavalry positioned along the river's eastern bank. Persian commanders expected the Macedonians to camp and rest after their march. Instead, their leader ordered an immediate crossing toward evening. While his senior general Parmenion counseled delay until morning, the king insisted on immediate action, famously remarking that the Hellespont would blush with shame if, having crossed it, they feared a minor river. The battle unfolded in phases. Macedonian light troops crossed first, drawing Persian cavalry down to the riverbank. Then, the royal commander led his companion cavalry across at an angle, striking the Persian left flank while the Macedonian phalanx engaged the center. The battle's decisive moment came in brutal hand-to-hand combat among the generals. The aggressive Macedonian himself targeted the Persian commanders, recognizing that Persian armies depended heavily on centralized leadership. During this melee, the king nearly lost his life when Spithridates, a Persian noble, raised his sword to strike from behind. Clytus the Black, one of the Macedonian officers, severed the Persian's arm with a desperate sword stroke, saving his sovereign's life, a deed that would have tragic consequences years later. With their leadership decimated, Persian forces collapsed into retreat. The victory established a beachhead in Asia and demonstrated the tactical brilliance of the invader. Rather than adopting defensive postures, as conventional wisdom might dictate for an invading force, he had embraced aggressive offensive action that kept Persian forces off balance. Following this victory, the young general faced a strategic choice. The direct route inland would lead toward the Persian heartland, but would leave hostile Greek cities along the Aegean coast behind his lines. Instead, he chose to secure his flanks and supply lines by liberating these Greek communities under Persian rule, advancing southward along the coast. This approach yielded both strategic and propaganda benefits. Greek cities welcomed the Macedonian as a liberator, providing supplies and safe harbors. He generally respected their autonomy, abolishing Persian-backed oligarchies and allowing democratic governance, though always with the understanding that they recognized his leadership of the Hellenic alliance. Not all cities submitted willingly. At Miletus, the invading force faced determined resistance, requiring its first major siege operation in Asia. The city's defenders expected relief from the Persian fleet, but Macedonian naval forces sealed the harbour. After the artillery breached the walls, generous terms were offered to the Greek defenders, while non-Greek populations were sold into slavery, a pattern that reflected the presentation of the campaign as a Hellenic crusade. Halicarnassus presented an even greater challenge. Here, the brilliant Persian commander, Memnon of Rhodes, had prepared sophisticated defences. The siege stretched for weeks as defenders used counterattacks and fireships against Macedonian positions. Though the city eventually fell, Memnon withdrew with much of his force intact, demonstrating that Persian resistance would not crumble easily. With coastal regions secured, the Macedonian king made a fateful decision that revealed the scope of his ambition. Rather than waiting for spring, as conventional campaign wisdom dictated, he divided his forces. The main army would take the coastal route towards Syria under Parmenion, while the monarch led a smaller force inland through Phrygia, reconnecting with winter supplies stored along the Mediterranean. This inland march brought the royal entourage to Gordium, capital of ancient Phrygia, where an opportunity for both practical rest and mythic symbolism presented itself. There, in the temple of Zeus, stood the famous Gordian knot, an intricate tangle of cords binding a wagon to a post. Local legend held that whoever untied this impossible knot would become ruler of Asia. After examining the knot, the ambitious leader attempted to untie it by conventional means. Finding no end to work with, he drew his sword and sliced through it with a single stroke. This bold solution, bypassing the terms of the challenge through decisive action, perfectly embodied his approach to seemingly insurmountable problems. Whether apocryphal or factual, the story captured something essential about his character and leadership style. As the campaign pressed eastward, concerning news arrived. Memnon of Rhodes, now commanding Persian naval forces, had launched a counteroffensive in the Aegean, threatening to bring the war back to Greece itself. This development highlighted the risk of advancing into Asia while Persian naval power remained unbroken. Before this threat could fully materialize, however, fate intervened. Memnon fell ill and died, depriving Persia of perhaps its most capable commander. Meanwhile, after nearly 2 years of limited engagement, the Persian king, Darius III, finally mobilized the empire's full might against the Macedonian invader. The collision of these forces would determine not just the campaign's outcome, but the fate of 2 civilizations. The ancient coastal plain near Issus, where modern Turkey meets Syria, became the setting for one of history's most consequential military encounters. Here, the full might of the Persian Empire under Darius III would directly confront the Macedonian forces for the first time. The battle that unfolded would transform what had begun as a limited campaign into an existential struggle between civilizations. Events leading to this confrontation followed a complex choreography of movement and counter-movement. The Macedonians had advanced southward along the Mediterranean coast, while Darius mobilized massive forces from across his empire. In a brilliant strategic maneuver, the Persian king marched his army behind the invaders, cutting their supply lines and positioning himself between the Macedonian army and its home territories. Learning of this development, the young commander reversed course with remarkable speed. Though his troops had been marching for days, he led them through the narrow coastal passes, separating modern Turkey from Syria. The 2 armies approached each other through different mountain passes, initially unaware of their proximity. The resulting encounter caught both leaders by surprise. The Macedonian general had not expected to face Darius so soon, while the Persian king had not anticipated the rapid countermarch of his opponents. The battlefield, a coastal plain, bounded by mountains on one side and the sea on the other, constrained both armies, preventing the Persians from fully deploying their superior numbers, estimated at between 100,000 to 600,000 troops, against the Macedonian force of approximately 40,000. The Greek commander quickly assessed the situation's potential advantages. The limited width of the plain neutralized the Persian numerical advantage, while the Pinarus River crossing would disrupt Persian cavalry charges. He deployed his forces with characteristic attention to terrain, placing the Thessalian cavalry on his left flank near the sea, the infantry phalanx in center, and his elite companion cavalry on the right, where he would personally lead the decisive charge. Across the river, Darius positioned himself in the traditional Persian manner, at the center of his forces, surrounded by his elite apple-bearers and kinsmen. The Persian king, resplendent in royal regalia upon a magnificent chariot, presented both an inspiring symbol to his forces and a visible target for the coming attack. The battle opened with skirmishing as light troops tested each other's positions. Then, in a trademark maneuver, the Macedonian king led his right wing in an oblique advance, drawing Persian forces toward him while creating gaps in their line. As the phalanx engaged Persian infantry across the river, the royal commander seized a critical moment, leading his companion cavalry in a thunderous charge directly toward Darius's position. This charge represented the quintessence of the Macedonian battlefield philosophy, a decisive thrust at the enemy's command structure. Persian troops fought valiantly to protect their king, and the fighting around the royal chariot became desperate. As the charging cavalry pressed closer, with javelins hurled toward the Persian command position, Darius faced a momentous decision. The great king of Persia, whose dominions stretched across 3 continents, whose word was law to millions, turned his chariot and fled the battlefield. This moment, whether motivated by prudent preservation of the royal person or simple fear, would haunt Darius and transform the conflict. What might have been a significant but limited defeat became a catastrophic rout as Persian forces witnessed their monarch's flight. The Persian left and center collapsed into chaotic retreat, though their Greek mercenaries on the right fought on with determined professionalism. Caught between the advancing Macedonian phalanx and the victorious cavalry, these mercenaries suffered heavy casualties before breaking off. In the Persian camp, the conquering forces discovered treasures beyond imagination: gold, precious fabrics, and exotic luxuries that dazzled soldiers from relatively austere Macedonia. More significant was the capture of Darius's family, his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, and his children. Their treatment would reveal much about the character and vision of their captor. Rather than subjecting these royal women to the customary fate of captives, rape and enslavement, the victorious ruler treated them with remarkable respect. He visited their tent, reassuring the Persian queen mother that her son still lived. When Sisygambis mistakenly prostrated herself before Hephaestion, thinking the tall, handsome officer was the king, the monarch simply remarked, "You were not mistaken, mother. He too is Alexander." This gracious gesture and the respectful treatment of the Persian royal family created a stark contrast with typical ancient warfare practices. Beyond its immediate military significance, Issus represented a psychological turning point. The Persian mystique of invincibility shattered as their god-king fled before the Macedonian charge. For the victorious troops, the triumph confirmed their growing sense that their young leader possessed almost superhuman abilities. The captured Persian treasury, 80,000 talents by some accounts, provided resources to continue the campaign indefinitely. For Darius, the defeat necessitated a complete strategic reconsideration. Having lost his family, much of his treasury, and incalculable prestige, he retreated to Babylon to raise fresh forces. From there, he sent letters offering a substantial ransom for his family, cession of all lands west of the Euphrates River, and his daughter's hand in marriage. These terms were rejected with characteristic ambition, with the reported reply that since the territories offered were already under Macedonian control, Darius was proposing to give what he no longer possessed. If Darius wanted peace, the message declared, he should come in person to request it, as a subject approaching his new king. This exchange revealed how fundamentally the dynamic had shifted. The conqueror no longer saw himself as merely leading a punitive expedition against Persia or liberating Greek cities. After Issus, his vision expanded to nothing less than complete conquest of the Persian Empire, an assumption of Darius's position as great king of Asia. The road from Issus led not back toward Greece, but deeper into Persian territory. The victorious general now faced a strategic decision, whether to pursue Darius immediately into the empire's heartland or secure the Mediterranean coastline to neutralize Persian naval power. His choice, to secure his flanks before advancing inland, would lead to one of ancient history's most extraordinary sieges. The ancient Phoenician city of Tyre stood as a seemingly impregnable obstacle on Alexander's path. Situated on an island half a mile from shore, surrounded by walls rising 150 feet from the water, and defended by a powerful navy, the city had withstood numerous sieges throughout its long history. Its citizens, confident in these defenses, rebuffed Alexander's initial diplomatic overtures, offering nominal submission while refusing his request to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles. Alexander could have bypassed this single resistant city, but its defiance threatened his strategic position. Unconquered Tyre could serve as a Persian naval base behind his advancing army. Moreover, the psychological impact of leaving such prominent resistance unchallenged might undermine the aura of inevitability he had cultivated since crossing into Asia. The difficult I will do immediately. The impossible will take a little longer. Though not directly attributed to Alexander, this sentiment captures his approach to the seemingly insurmountable challenge of Tyre. If he could not reach the island city by sea, he would transform geography itself, connecting island to mainland. Thus began one of history's most audacious engineering projects. Alexander ordered the construction of a mole, a solid causeway extending from shore to island through waters up to 20 feet deep. His engineers felled trees from the Lebanese mountains, drove wooden piles into the seabed, and filled the structure with stone and rubble. The work proceeded under constant harassment from Tyrian ships and artillery fire from the city walls. As the mole approached the island, the water deepened and currents strengthened, washing away material as quickly as it could be placed. Alexander responded by widening the causeway and constructing floating barriers to protect workers. The Tyrians countered by sending a fire ship, an old vessel packed with combustible materials, that destroyed the siege towers and much of the mole's advanced section. Lesser commanders might have abandoned the seemingly futile effort. Alexander instead redoubled it, simultaneously recognizing that he needed naval superiority to complement his land-based approach. In a remarkable diplomatic achievement, he persuaded the Phoenician cities already under his control to provide ships, while Cyprus contributed additional vessels. Within weeks, Alexander had assembled a fleet of over 200 warships that neutralized Tyre's naval advantage. With naval superiority established, Alexander resumed construction of the mole while preparing specialized siege equipment. Shipwrights built floating platforms carrying the tallest siege towers ever constructed, while engineers developed more powerful artillery to breach Tyre's massive walls. After nearly 7 months of continuous effort, Macedonian forces finally breached the defenses. The fall of Tyre revealed both Alexander's technical brilliance and his capacity for calculated brutality. Upon breaking through, his troops inflicted terrible vengeance for the city's defiance and their own losses. Ancient sources report 8,000 Tyrians killed in combat, with 30,000 survivors sold into slavery. Alexander himself participated in the final assault, fighting atop the walls alongside common soldiers. In a grim, symbolic gesture, he ordered crucifixions along the shoreline and pardoned only those who had taken refuge in the temple of Melkart, Heracles. With the Phoenician coast secured, Alexander turned southward toward Egypt. Gaza, the final Persian stronghold along the Mediterranean, attempted resistance under its commander Batis. Like Tyre, the city occupied an elevated position considered impregnable. Alexander's response proved equally determined, constructing earthen ramps to bring siege engines against the walls while personally leading assaults. During this siege, Alexander sustained a serious shoulder wound from a catapult bolt that penetrated his armor. After Gaza's fall, Alexander inflicted punishment that echoed Achilles' treatment of Hector in the Iliad. According to some accounts, he ordered Batis, still living, to be dragged behind a chariot around the city walls. Though possibly apocryphal, such stories reflect how Alexander increasingly measured himself against mythic standards of heroism, with troubling implications for those who opposed him. The road to Egypt now lay open, and Alexander's forces entered the ancient land without resistance. Persian authority had always rested uneasily in Egypt, where foreign rulers were regarded with particular suspicion. The satrap Mazaces, recognizing the futility of resistance after the fall of Tyre and Gaza, surrendered the province intact. Alexander approached Egypt not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, respecting local customs and religious sensibilities. He made sacrifices to Egyptian gods, particularly Apis, and began planning a city that would become his most enduring physical legacy, Alexandria. Located at a strategic point on the Mediterranean coast, this planned city embodied Alexander's vision of fusing Greek and Egyptian cultures while facilitating trade throughout the Mediterranean. During his Egyptian sojourn, Alexander undertook a journey that has fascinated and puzzled historians ever since. With a small company, he traveled across the desert to the remote oasis of Siwa, site of an oracle dedicated to Amun, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus. The purpose of this dangerous journey, far from military necessity, appears to have been deeply personal. At Siwa, Alexander entered the inner sanctuary alone. What transpired there remains one of history's great mysteries. According to later accounts, the oracle addressed him as the son of Amun, Zeus, and prophesied his unmatched success. Alexander emerged transformed, never revealing the exact words exchanged, but increasingly receptive to suggestions of his own divinity. This visit marked a significant evolution in Alexander's self-conception. While earlier he had claimed descent from Heracles and Achilles through his Macedonian bloodline, the Siwa experience suggested direct divine parentage. This notion, unsettling to traditional Macedonians, aligned with Egyptian conceptions of pharaonic authority and Persian ideas of divinely sanctioned kingship. In Egypt, Alexander demonstrated remarkable administrative acumen alongside his military genius. Rather than imposing Macedonian officials throughout the province, he established a system of divided authority. A Macedonian garrison commander oversaw military matters, while native Egyptians retained control of civil administration and religious affairs. This approach, respecting local traditions while ensuring ultimate Macedonian authority, became a template for governance throughout his expanding empire. After organizing Egypt's administration and initiating Alexandria's construction, Alexander turned his attention once more toward the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius had used the breathing space provided by Alexander's coastal campaign to gather fresh armies from the empire's eastern provinces. The decisive confrontation between these rulers, deferred since Issus, would soon determine the fate of Persia itself. The vast plains near the ancient city of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, became the stage for history's most decisive clash of civilizations. Here, in the late autumn, nearly 4 years into his campaign, the Macedonian king would face Darius III's last, greatest effort to preserve the Persian Empire. Unlike previous encounters, the Persian ruler had chosen the battlefield carefully and prepared it meticulously to maximize his advantages. The disparity in forces remained enormous. Ancient sources suggest Darius had assembled between 200,000 and 1 million troops, including contingents from the furthest reaches of his domain: Bactrians and Sogdians from Central Asia, Indians from the eastern provinces, Scythian horsemen from the steppes. Most significantly, he had gathered the largest cavalry force ever seen, supplemented by scythed chariots designed to break infantry formations, and 15 war elephants brought from India. Against this host, the invading general commanded approximately 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Though his army had incorporated some Asian troops during the campaign, it remained predominantly Macedonian and Greek. The looming confrontation pitted not merely armies against each other, but fundamentally different military systems and philosophies of warfare. The young conqueror approached the coming battle with characteristic thoroughness. For days, his scouts studied the terrain, while he interrogated local inhabitants about Persian preparations. Learning that Darius had ordered the ground leveled to facilitate chariot operations, the Macedonian commander recognized the need for innovative counter-tactics rather than his usual direct assault. On the night before battle, the commander's behavior displayed his complex psychology. While Persian campfires made the plain look like a sea of flame, he slept soundly. When Parmenion, anxious about the overwhelming enemy numbers, suggested a night attack, the response was a refusal, stating he would not steal his victory. This reflected both supreme confidence and a conception of warfare as a stage for personal glory, not merely a means to political ends. Dawn revealed the full spectacle of Darius's assembled might. The Persian center featured the Immortals, elite infantry who served as the empire's core fighting force, flanked by contingents from across the empire, with powerful cavalry wings extending on both sides. Chariots were positioned at the front, ready to charge, while Darius himself again commanded from the center, surrounded by his kinsmen and royal guard. The Macedonian forces were deployed in a more complex arrangement than at Issus. The phalanx formed the center, while the left wing, under Parmenion, consisted primarily of Thessalian cavalry, tasked with holding against the Persian right. On his own right wing, the king positioned his companion cavalry in an oblique formation, with additional infantry units arranged in depth to protect against flank attacks. Most innovatively, he created a second line of infantry behind the main formation, a reserve that could face about if the Persians attempted to envelop the Macedonian army. As the armies closed, Darius launched his chariots against the Macedonian lines. The wily tactician had prepared his troops for this threat, creating channels in the formation through which the chariots could pass harmlessly. Archers and javelin throwers targeted the drivers, while disciplined infantry stepped aside at the last moment, then closed ranks to attack the chariots from behind. This tactical innovation neutralized one of Darius's most fearsome weapons before the main battle even joined. The battle's decisive phase began when the Macedonian leader, observing Persian troops shifting leftward to outflank his right wing, led his companion cavalry in a diagonal advance toward the Persian center. Darius, recognizing the threat to his position, ordered his left flank cavalry to intercept. This created a gap in the Persian line, a vulnerability that had been anticipated and would now be exploited. Wheeling his cavalry into this opening, the royal commander drove directly toward Darius, with the elite companion cavalry formed in a wedge. The Persian center, facing this determined assault, led by the distinctive figure of the fearsome Macedonian himself, began to waver. Though Persian nobles fought desperately to protect their king, the psychological impact of the charge proved overwhelming. For the second time, Darius chose personal survival over standing with his troops. As his chariot turned to leave the battlefield, panic spread through Persian ranks. What began as an organized retreat collapsed into rout across vast sections of their line. Sensing victory, the pursuing cavalry pressed their advantage with a pursuit aimed directly at capturing Darius himself. On the Macedonian left, however, the situation had grown desperate. Parmenian's forces faced overwhelming numbers of Persian and Indian cavalry that threatened to break through to the baggage trains. Messages reached the commanding general, pleading for reinforcement. History turned on the response to this crisis. Pursuit of Darius might have ended the war immediately with the Persian king's capture, but abandonment of the left wing risked catastrophic defeat. The victorious leader chose his army's survival over personal glory. Reluctantly abandoning the pursuit, he led his cavalry in a sweeping arc across the battlefield to reinforce Parmenion. By the time they arrived, the situation had stabilized, but the delay had allowed Darius to escape with a small retinue. Despite this missed opportunity, Gaugamela represented a masterpiece of battlefield command. Against vastly superior numbers on terrain chosen by his adversary, the Macedonian had achieved a victory so complete that the Persian Empire effectively ceased to exist as a unified entity. The spoils were immense. The Persian royal treasury at Susa, and later Persepolis, would yield wealth beyond imagination. More significant than material prizes was the transformation of the victor's status. Following Gaugamela, he assumed the title King of Asia, claiming Darius's position as his own rather than merely defeating him as an enemy. At Babylon, he received the city's surrender with elaborate ceremonies, accepting homage as the legitimate successor to Mesopotamian royal traditions thousands of years old. This evolution revealed an expanding conception of role. No longer merely a Macedonian king leading a Hellenic crusade against Persia, the conqueror now positioned himself as the rightful ruler of a multi-ethnic empire. This transition would create tension with his Macedonian veterans, who had envisioned punishing Persia, not inheriting and preserving its imperial structures. As the Macedonian army advanced eastward toward the Persian heartland, capturing the royal capitals of Susa and Persepolis with their unimaginable treasures, their leader found himself in an unprecedented position. No Greek or Macedonian had ever wielded such power or confronted the challenges of governing such vast territories with diverse populations, languages, and traditions. How these challenges would be met would reveal much about both political vision and evolving identity. The road to Persepolis, ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, led the Macedonian army through the Persian gates. a narrow mountain pass where determined defenders could hold vast armies at bay. Here, the satrap Ariobarzanes had positioned troops to make a final stand before the sacred capital. Rather than attempt a costly frontal assault, the invading commander displayed his typical ingenuity. Leaving part of his force to fix the Persian defenders in position, he led a small contingent along a treacherous mountain path, guided by local shepherds. This maneuver allowed his forces to attack the Persian position from both front and rear simultaneously, transforming a formidable defensive position into a death trap for its defenders. Persepolis itself surrendered without resistance, yielding treasures that dwarfed even the riches of Babylon and Susa. The royal palace complex, built over generations by Darius I, Xerxes, and their successors, stood as the ultimate symbol of Persian imperial might. Here rested the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of Persian dominance: gold, silver, precious gems, and priceless works of art from across the known world. For 3 months, the conquering army remained in Persepolis, resting from their campaigns, while pack animals transported the royal treasury, a task requiring 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels, according to ancient sources. During this interlude, the contradictions in the young king's position became increasingly apparent. To Persians, he presented himself as the legitimate successor to Darius, upholding imperial continuity. To his Macedonians, he remained the avenger of Greece, punishing Persian aggression dating back to Xerxes' invasion a century and a half earlier. This tension culminated in one of history's most spectacular acts of destruction. After a night of drinking and revelry, the victorious ruler and his companions set fire to the ceremonial palaces of Persepolis. Ancient sources offer conflicting explanations: a calculated political statement symbolizing the end of Persian power, an act of vengeance for Xerxes' burning of Athens, or the impulsive suggestion of an Athenian courtesan named Thais. Whatever the motivation, the flames that consumed these architectural masterpieces marked a point of no return. The conqueror could no longer claim to be merely punishing Persia. He had now assumed responsibility for its future. While the palaces still smoldered, news arrived that Darius had retreated eastward toward Ecbatana with the remnants of his forces. The Macedonian commander immediately resumed pursuit, driving his army at a punishing pace across the Iranian plateau. Near the Caspian gates, he learned that Bessus, satrap of Bactria and a relative of Darius, had placed the Persian king under arrest, assuming authority as his forces disintegrated. This treachery transformed the nature of the pursuit. No longer chasing an enemy monarch, the Macedonian general now positioned himself as the legitimate defender of Persian royal authority against usurpers. Pushing his elite units to the limits of human endurance, the relentless pursuer closed the distance to Darius's captors. In the ensuing chaos, Bessus and his co-conspirators mortally wounded the Persian king and fled eastward. According to historical accounts, the young monarch arrived to find Darius dying from multiple stab wounds. In a moment of poignant symbolism, he covered the fallen emperor with his own cloak in a gesture of respect. Whether this encounter actually occurred or was later embellished, it perfectly symbolized the transfer of legitimate authority from the Achaemenid dynasty to Macedonia. The victor now presented himself not as Darius's conqueror, but as his rightful successor and avenger. The pursuit of Bessus led the Macedonian forces into territories largely unknown to the Greek world. The army crossed into Bactria and Sogdiana, regions corresponding to modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. Here, among remote mountain valleys and arid steppes, the invaders faced a fundamentally different type of warfare than the set-piece battles and formal sieges of the Mediterranean world. Bessus, declaring himself King Artaxerxes V, attempted to rally resistance using traditional Persian reverence for the royal bloodline. However, his support proved limited, and the relentless Macedonian pursuit eventually forced his abandonment by his own followers. Brought before his captor in chains, the usurper suffered mutilation before execution, a punishment following Persian royal tradition rather than Greek practice, highlighting the adoption of a new imperial role. Yet capturing Bessus did not secure these eastern territories. Unlike the centralized Persian provinces to the west, Bactria and Sogdiana consisted of fiercely independent regions dominated by local aristocracy. These nobles controlled nearly impregnable mountain fortresses and commanded the loyalty of tough steppe warriors with no tradition of submission to distant authority. The response to this challenge revealed remarkable adaptability as a commander. Rather than relying solely on heavy infantry, whose phalanx formations were ill-suited to mountain warfare, the military genius reorganized his forces to emphasize mobility. Light infantry and cavalry units conducted rapid strikes against rebel concentrations, while engineering teams developed new techniques for assaulting mountain strongholds. The legendary Sogdian Rock exemplified these seemingly impossible fortresses. When called to surrender, its defenders reportedly laughed, saying they would need men with wings to capture the position. The resourceful general asked for volunteers from among his mountain troops, skilled climbers who might ascend the cliffs using iron pegs and ropes. 300 men made the perilous night climb, losing 30 of their number to falls, but successfully reaching the summit by dawn. When the Sogdian defenders awoke to see Macedonian soldiers above them, their confidence collapsed. Once again, the seemingly impossible had been achieved through a combination of technical innovation and the almost superhuman efforts of determined troops. Similar patterns repeated across the region, as fortress after fortress fell to unconventional tactics. Beyond military challenges, the conquering ruler faced the need to establish sustainable governance across these vast new territories. His solution combined military presence with political integration. He established a network of cities, many bearing his name, at strategic points, settling veteran soldiers alongside local populations. More controversially, he began incorporating Bactrian and Sogdian nobles into his administration and army, recognizing that permanent control required local cooperation rather than perpetual occupation. This eastern campaign, lasting nearly 3 years, tested both commander and army as never before. The harsh climate, difficult terrain, and persistent guerrilla resistance strained both morale and loyalty. Previously, the troops had marched toward famous cities with the promise of legendary wealth. Now they fought in obscure mountain passes against enemies who melted away, rather than offering the glory of pitched battle, all while moving ever further from their Mediterranean homeland. Yet these harsh experiences transformed both the man and his imperial project. The pragmatic adaptations required for Eastern conquest, integrating local elites, adopting indigenous administrative systems, creating multicultural urban centers, laid the groundwork for the Hellenistic synthesis that would define his legacy. Out of military necessity emerged a new political vision that would reshape civilization across 3 continents. As the campaigns carried him ever eastward, a subtle yet profound transformation occurred in the conqueror's relationship with Persian culture. What began as pragmatic accommodation gradually evolved into deliberate policy, reflecting both political calculation and personal fascination with the sophisticated imperial traditions encountered. The first visible signs of this transformation appeared in the Macedonian leader's personal appearance. The simple military garb gave way to elements of Persian royal attire, rich purple fabrics, the diadem or royal headband, and embroidered garments that distinguished the king from even his highest-ranking subjects. While maintaining his distinctive armor and weapons in battle, the young monarch increasingly presented himself to Asian subjects in forms they recognized as emblems of legitimate authority. More significant was his gradual adoption of Persian court ceremonies, particularly proskynesis, a ritual greeting where subjects prostrated themselves before the king. To Persian eyes, this represented appropriate respect for royal authority. To Macedonians and Greeks, it suggested worship reserved for gods rather than men. When the sovereign began encouraging this practice among all his subjects, regardless of origin, it triggered profound discomfort among his Macedonian companions, who prided themselves on their frank, almost equal relationship with their leader. This cultural tension erupted into open conflict at a banquet where the king attempted to formalize the practice. Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who served as the expedition's official historian, publicly refused to perform proskynesis, declaring it un-Greek and inappropriate for a Macedonian ruler. His resistance became a rallying point for traditionalists who feared their commander was abandoning his heritage for foreign customs. Behind these ceremonial changes lay deeper administrative necessities. As the empire expanded across diverse regions, the pragmatic ruler recognized the impracticality of displacing established Persian systems that had effectively governed these territories for centuries. Increasingly, he retained Persian satraps who proved loyal, incorporating them into a hybrid administrative structure that preserved local expertise while ensuring ultimate accountability to himself. This pragmatism extended to military organization. The Persian Empire had developed sophisticated systems for moving messages, supplies, and troops across vast distances. Rather than dismantling these networks, the conqueror adapted them to his purposes, retaining Persian officials who understood regional conditions while introducing Macedonian oversight. This approach maintained essential services while gradually reshaping them around his authority. Perhaps most controversial among his Macedonians was the incorporation of Persian and other Asian troops into the army itself. The military innovator ordered the training of 30,000 youths from eastern provinces in Macedonian weapons and tactics, clearly intending them as more than auxiliary forces. While presented as expanding the army's capabilities, this initiative suggested a longer-term vision where Persians and Macedonians would share military authority rather than maintaining conqueror-subject distinctions. The monarch's personal life similarly reflected this cultural synthesis. In Bactria, he married Roxana, daughter of a powerful local noble. Unlike his later political marriages, this union appears to have contained genuine affection. More importantly, it symbolized a new approach to imperial rule, not merely conquering territory, but binding diverse peoples through marriage alliances and cultural respect. For conservative Macedonians, however, it represented their king's growing distance from his roots. The tensions created by these changes came to a head in several incidents that revealed the fracturing consensus among the inner circle. At one infamous banquet in Maracanda, modern Samarkand, a drunken argument erupted between the king and his close companion, Clitus the Black, the man who had saved the royal life at the Granicus River. When Clitus accused his leader of abandoning Macedonian traditions and compared him unfavorably to Philip, the royal rage exploded. Seizing a spear, the enraged monarch struck Clitus dead before horrified onlookers. The aftermath revealed a complex psychology. Initial rage gave way to overwhelming remorse. For 3 days, the conqueror of Asia lay in his tent, refusing food and company, alternately calling for his own death and invoking religious justifications for his action. This incident, more than any battle or siege, exposed the dangerous instability that accompanied expanding power and changing identity. Further evidence of growing paranoia emerged in the Pages conspiracy, where royal pages were accused of plotting assassination. Under torture, some implicated Callisthenes, the historian who had opposed Proskynesis. Though evidence of his involvement remained circumstantial, Callisthenes was arrested and later died in custody. This harsh response to perceived threats suggested increasing isolation and suspicion, even among the closest advisors. Yet alongside these troubling developments, the cultural adaptations yielded remarkable administrative innovations. The famous policy of encouraging intermarriage between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen created bonds between conquering and conquered elites. The education of Persian youths in Greek language and culture, while maintaining their native traditions, laid foundations for the multicultural Hellenistic civilization that would flourish afterward. Most visionary was the concept of homonoia, or unity of minds, a revolutionary idea that different peoples could become partners in civilization, rather than perpetual enemies defined by ethnic origin. While imperfectly implemented and often undermined by practical politics, this concept represented a profound departure from the traditional Greek division of the world into Hellenes and barbarians. As preparations began to push beyond the former Persian Empire toward India, these cultural transformations had profoundly altered both self-conception and relationship with the original Macedonian companions. The young king, who had crossed the Hellespont as the champion of Hellenic civilization against Persian barbarism, now saw himself as the legitimate heir to both traditions, creating something greater than either alone. This evolving vision would be tested severely in the extraordinary adventures that lay ahead. The transformation of Alexander from Macedonian king to world conqueror involved not just expanding territories, but an evolving psychology that fascinated ancient historians and continues to intrigue modern analysts. The young prince who crossed into Asia displayed remarkable confidence, ambition, and tactical brilliance. But the man who emerged through years of unbroken conquest and absolute power underwent profound psychological changes, some creative, others disturbing. The most significant evolution appeared in Alexander's conception of his own identity and destiny. Beginning the campaign as Philip's heir, avenging Greek humiliations, he gradually adopted a far more grandiose self-image. The visit to the oracle at Siwa, where priests allegedly addressed him as the son of Amun's Zeus, provided divine sanction for increasingly superhuman aspirations. What began, perhaps, as useful political mythology became, through years of success and adulation, something Alexander himself appeared to believe. This expanding self-conception manifested in his approach to obstacles. When advisors described some goal as impossible, crossing a desert, scaling an impregnable fortress, traversing an unknown ocean, Alexander became not discouraged, but energized. The conquests themselves seemed to recede in importance compared to the act of overcoming limitations that constrained ordinary humans. As one ancient writer observed, he seemed not so much to be conquering the world as liberating himself from its constraints. Concurrent with this expanding sense of possibility came increasingly volatile emotions, particularly after drinking. Alexander had always enjoyed symposia, the ritualized drinking gatherings central to Macedonian culture. Yet as campaigns progressed, these occasions more frequently erupted into violence. The killing of Clitus represented the most tragic example, But other incidents revealed a man whose emotions could flash instantaneously from affection to murderous rage, especially when his divine pretensions or achievements faced questioning. This emotional instability appeared alongside growing physical pressures. By this stage of his campaigns, Alexander's body bore the accumulated trauma of numerous severe wounds. A pike thrust through his shoulder, an arrow through his lung, another arrow that shattered his ankle bone, a stone that fractured his skull, and multiple lesser injuries. These wounds, heroically endured and prominently displayed, enhanced his mystique among troops, but likely caused chronic pain, managed through increasing alcohol consumption. Perhaps most troubling was Alexander's evolving relationship with truth and critical perspectives. The young king, who had studied under Aristotle and valued frank counsel from advisors, grew increasingly isolated within a bubble of adulation. Those who questioned his judgment, like Parmenion, found themselves marginalized or eliminated. Callisthenes, once valued for his historical documentation, became dangerous once he criticized Alexander's pretensions. The court atmosphere shifted toward an expectation of agreement rather than honest counsel. This deteriorating tolerance for opposition culminated in the Philotas affair, which revealed both Alexander's growing paranoia and his willingness to use torture against former friends. Philotas, son of Parmenion and commander of the Companion cavalry, failed to immediately report an alleged conspiracy against Alexander. Under torture, he confessed to involvement before being executed. Alexander then arranged the assassination of Parmenion, who held command in Media, fearing the reaction of this powerful general to his son's execution. These actions shocked the Macedonian nobility, who maintained traditions where even kings were subject to certain protocols and protections. The use of torture against aristocrats, secret trials, and execution of a commander like Parmenion without formal charges represented profound violations of Macedonian custom. The message was clear. Alexander now operated beyond traditional constraints, answerable only to himself and his conception of destiny. Yet alongside these troubling developments existed genuine psychological growth and vision. Alexander demonstrated remarkable cultural adaptability, absorbing Persian, Egyptian, and later Indian influences while maintaining core Hellenic values. This intellectual flexibility enabled him to envision governance systems incorporating diverse traditions, rather than simply imposing Greek norms, a revolutionary concept in an era where cultural chauvinism was the norm. His dream of a world unified not through subjugation, but cultural exchange, represented genuine psychological evolution beyond the parochial worldview of contemporary Greeks. When he arranged mass marriages between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, encouraged adoption of useful Persian customs, or incorporated Eastern troops into his army's core, Alexander acted from a genuinely integrated multicultural perspective, rare in any era. This complex psychological portrait, expanding vision alongside deteriorating restraint, cultural adaptability with growing intolerance for criticism, superhuman aspirations with increasingly human frailties, makes Alexander endlessly fascinating. Rather than a simple progression or decline, his psychological evolution represented the paradoxical development of a unique individual, wielding unprecedented power in unprecedented circumstances. As his campaigns pushed toward India, these psychological contradictions intensified. The man who had started with clearly defined objectives now pursued an open-ended quest for the boundaries of the possible. His Macedonian veterans, who had followed him beyond the limits of their known world, increasingly struggled to understand what drove their king ever eastward. The tension between Alexander's expanding personal vision and the more concrete desires of his men would soon reach a breaking point. The mighty Indus River and its tributaries mark the easternmost fringe of Persian influence, beyond which lay the largely unknown subcontinent of India. For the conqueror who had subdued the entire Persian Empire and pacified the Central Asian provinces, this mysterious land represented both the logical next step in his eastward march and an irresistible new horizon for exploration. Ancient Greek knowledge of India consisted primarily of fantastical tales of extraordinary creatures, fabulous wealth, and philosophical sages with miraculous powers, a tempting frontier for a leader who increasingly measured himself against mythic standards. The Indian campaign began with diplomatic initiatives. The Macedonian ruler dispatched envoys to various authorities in the Punjab region, attempting to arrange peaceful submission or alliance. The responses varied dramatically. Some smaller kingdoms readily acknowledged Macedonian authority, seeing potential advantages in alliance with this powerful newcomer. Others, particularly the formidable King Porus, proudly maintained their independence, setting the stage for military confrontation. Before engaging these larger kingdoms, the young general subdued the mountainous regions of what is now northern Pakistan. These campaigns against the Aspasians, Assassinians, and other tribes involved some of the most challenging mountain warfare his army had yet faced. Fortress cities like Masaga and Aonos required innovative siege techniques developed through years of eastern campaigning. At Aonos particularly, his troops constructed elevated platforms and used catapults in novel ways to overcome seemingly impregnable defenses. After securing the mountain approaches, he established alliances with several Indian rulers, most notably King Ambi, called Taxiles by Greek sources of Taxila. This diplomatic achievement provided the Macedonian army with a secure base and valuable intelligence about the region's geography and politics. Ambi's detailed descriptions of neighboring kingdoms, particularly the military power of King Porus beyond the Hydaspes River, helped the invader prepare for the campaign's most significant confrontation. Porus commanded a formidable fighting force that included elements entirely new to Macedonian experience, most notably war elephants. These massive creatures, trained for battle and carrying armed soldiers in towers on their backs, had the potential to devastate traditional infantry formations through sheer physical power and psychological impact. Additionally, Porus fielded excellent cavalry and chariots suited to the open plains of Punjab. The first challenge faced was crossing the Hydaspes River, modern Jhelum, swollen by seasonal monsoon rains and closely watched by Porus's forces on the opposite bank. Rather than attempting a direct crossing against prepared defenses, the cunning strategist employed elaborate deception. For weeks, he ordered noisy demonstrations at various points along the river, conditioning Porus to false alarms and gradual complacency. Then, selecting a point where a wooded island helped conceal movements, the daring commander personally led a force of his best troops across the river during a stormy night. The actual crossing involved both swimming and improvised rafts, highlighting the king's willingness to share the same dangers and discomforts as his men. By dawn, a substantial Macedonian force had established a bridgehead on Porus's side of the river. Learning of the crossing, Porus faced a difficult decision. He dispatched his son with a cavalry force to counter the initial threat, while determining whether this represented the main effort or another feint. The ensuing cavalry battle resulted in the death of Porus's son and the destruction of his detachment, confirming that the Macedonian king himself led this attack. Porus now deployed his main army to face the invading force, creating a battle line anchored by his elephants placed at regular intervals like walled cities, with infantry and cavalry arranged between and behind them. This innovative formation presented the Greek general with an entirely new tactical challenge. as his traditional approach of cavalry assault against the flanks risked being disrupted by the elephant's presence across the entire front. The Battle of the Hydaspes demonstrated tactical adaptability at its finest. Rather than employing the standard oblique advance and cavalry hammer and anvil maneuver, the resourceful commander developed an entirely new approach suited to these unique circumstances. His forces engaged in a complex series of maneuvers, first drawing Porus's cavalry away from the protection of the elephants, then exploiting the resulting gaps with coordinated infantry and cavalry attacks. As the battle progressed, the disciplined Macedonian phalanx demonstrated remarkable steadiness in the face of charging elephants, creating lanes through which the creatures passed before being attacked from behind. The intense fighting lasted hours, with Porus himself fighting from atop his elephant even after being wounded. Eventually, surrounded and with his army disintegrating, the Indian king continued fighting until the victor sent an Indian ally to negotiate his surrender. The meeting between the two kings became legendary. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus reportedly replied, "As a king." Impressed by this dignity in defeat, the conqueror not only spared Porus, but expanded his territories, requiring only acknowledgement of Macedonian authority. This treatment reflected both respect for a worthy opponent and the evolving approach to empire building through partnership with local elites rather than mere subjugation. Following this victory, the Macedonian forces pressed further eastward, fighting numerous smaller engagements against regional powers. The army crossed the Asizines, Chenab, and Hydraotes, Ravi rivers, subduing territories between them. At the fortified city of Sangala, they faced determined resistance from confederated Indian tribes, requiring a formal siege before the city fell with considerable bloodshed. Throughout these Indian campaigns, the expedition encountered phenomena entirely new to Mediterranean experience. Monsoon rains that transformed dry riverbeds into raging torrents, jungles teeming with unknown plants and animals, and cultural practices utterly foreign to Greek and Macedonian traditions. Scientists and philosophers accompanying the expedition documented these discoveries, collecting specimens and recording observations that would transform Greek understanding of geography and natural history. The decisive moment of the Indian campaign came not in battle, but on the banks of the Hyphasis River, modern Bays. Here, with the vast Ganges plain beyond and rumors of enormous kingdoms still to conquer, the ambitious leader announced his intention to continue eastward. For the first time in the entire expedition, his army refused to follow. After years of continuous campaigning, thousands of miles from home, the Macedonian and Greek soldiers had reached their psychological limit. For 3 days, the frustrated king secluded himself in his tent, refusing to speak with anyone, attempting to break his army's will through his displeasure. When this failed to sway them, he made one final appeal, recounting their shared achievements and the glory that awaited further east. The soldiers listened in respectful silence, but remained unmoved. Finally, taking the reluctant advice of his generals and interpreting unfavorable omens from sacrifices, he agreed to turn back. Though presented as a divine sign, marking the expedition's intended limit, this moment represented the great commander's first significant defeat, not by an enemy, but by the human limitations of his own men. For someone who increasingly measured himself against gods and heroes, this constraint imposed by mortal endurance must have been particularly galling. Nevertheless, he marked the spot with 12 massive altars, honoring the Olympian gods before beginning the journey westward. Rather than simply retracing his path, the undaunted explorer chose to investigate the southern reaches of the Indus River system, a decision that maintained the expedition's exploratory purpose while acceding to the army's desire to move homeward. This compromise preserved both his authority and the army's morale, while opening new territories to Macedonian influence. The return journey from India presented Alexander with an opportunity to consolidate and institutionalize his vision of cultural fusion between East and West. Having conquered territories spanning Europe, Africa, and Asia, he now faced the challenge of transforming military victory into stable governance. The policies he implemented during this period revealed both pragmatic statecraft and a revolutionary conceptual leap beyond contemporary thinking about the relationship between different civilizations. Most dramatic among these initiatives was the mass marriage ceremony at Susa, where Alexander arranged unions between nearly 100 of his senior Macedonian and Greek officers and noble Persian women. He himself participated, adding 2 Persian princesses, Statera, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes III, to his marriage with Roxana. Unlike traditional political marriages, which remained largely symbolic, Alexander insisted these unions be consummated and legitimate children produced, creating biological bonds between conquering and conquered elites. The symbolism of these marriages extended beyond personal alliances. They represented a direct challenge to Greek notions of inherent cultural superiority and the traditional distinction between Hellenes and barbarians. By having his closest companions literally join bloodlines with Persian nobility, Alexander established a new elite that transcended ethnic boundaries, united instead by loyalty to himself and participation in a shared imperial project. Concurrent with these marriages, Alexander implemented his controversial policy of integrating Persian and other Asian troops directly into Macedonian military units. The training of 30,000 Persian youths in Macedonian weapons and tactics, begun years earlier, had produced a corps of soldiers, organized in traditional Macedonian formations, but drawn from Eastern populations. Now, rather than maintaining these as separate auxiliary units, Alexander began incorporating them directly into the companion units that formed the army's elite corps. This military integration triggered intense resistance from traditional Macedonians, who viewed their distinctive fighting methods and privileged position in the army's structure as birthright and national identity. When Alexander appointed Persians to the prestigious companion cavalry and incorporated them into the Agema, royal guard, veteran Macedonian soldiers saw not multicultural progress, but dilution of their earned status and the special relationship with their king that had defined their service. Tensions erupted at Opis, where Alexander announced the discharge of veterans too wounded or elderly for continued service, with generous bonuses for their return to Macedonia. Rather than gratitude, this announcement triggered a mutiny among troops who interpreted it as Alexander, discarding them now that Persian replacements had been trained. The king's furious response, personally identifying and condemning ringleaders for execution, demonstrated both his determination to implement integration and the fragility of his control over increasingly restive Macedonian troops. The subsequent reconciliation at Opis featured one of Alexander's most powerful symbolic gestures. After initial punishment of mutiny leaders, he arranged an elaborate banquet where Macedonians and Persians sat together, with himself at the center. The feast culminated in a prayer for homonoia, unity of minds, or concord, between Europeans and Asians, and prosperity for the shared Commonwealth. This ceremony represented perhaps the clearest articulation of Alexander's revolutionary vision, not merely conquest, but the creation of a new synthesis transcending traditional civilizational boundaries. Beyond these high-profile initiatives, Alexander implemented practical administrative measures that institutionalized cultural fusion. He established numerous cities throughout his conquered territories, settling mixed populations of Macedonian veterans Greek merchants, and local inhabitants. These urban centers, generally named Alexandria, served as administrative hubs while facilitating cultural and economic exchange between diverse populations. The educational aspects of Alexander's fusion policy often receive less attention than dramatic ceremonies, but may have produced more lasting effects. He established Greek-style gymnasiums in major Eastern cities, creating institutions where young men from diverse backgrounds received common education in Hellenic literature, philosophy, and athletic training. Simultaneously, he encouraged Greek and Macedonian officials to learn Persian languages and customs, creating a bilingual administrative class capable of mediating between different traditions. Alexander's approach to religion, similarly, reflected both respect for diversity and attempts at synthesis. Rather than imposing Greek cults on Eastern populations, he participated in indigenous religious ceremonies, while identifying points of connection between different traditions. This religious tolerance, radical by contemporary standards, recognized the impracticality of forcing cultural change in deeply personal domains while maintaining overall imperial cohesion. The economic dimension of Alexander's fusion policies created perhaps the most immediate practical benefits. By establishing a standardized currency system throughout his territories and improving transportation infrastructure, he facilitated unprecedented commercial exchange between previously separated regions. Greek merchants found new markets in Mesopotamia and Persia, while Eastern goods and ideas flowed westward at increasing rates. This commercial integration created vested interests in maintaining the political structures that facilitated such profitable exchange. For all their visionary aspects, Alexander's fusion policies contained significant limitations and contradictions. Despite rhetoric of partnership, real power remained firmly in Macedonian and Greek hands, with Eastern elites serving as junior partners at best. The vast majority of common people throughout the empire experienced little practical change in their daily lives beyond paying taxes to different overlords. Most fundamentally, the entire system depended on Alexander's personal authority rather than sustainable institutions that could survive his eventual passing. These tensions would become increasingly apparent as Alexander led his army back toward the empire's center, navigating difficult terrain while attempting to consolidate his vast conquests into a functioning political entity. The young king, who had left Macedonia with clear objectives, had evolved into an emperor with revolutionary aspirations, but increasingly tenuous control over the forces he had unleashed. Whether his unprecedented vision could survive the practical challenges of governance and his own increasingly erratic behavior remained an open question. Having reached the easternmost extent of his conquests at the Hyphasis River, Alexander faced the immense challenge of leading his army back toward the heart of his empire. Rather than simply retracing his path, he chose an ambitious southern route that would allow him to subdue the lower Indus Valley while exploring the ocean beyond, a journey that would test his forces against nature itself more severely than any human enemy. The initial stages of this return took Alexander's army down the Hydaspes River on a hastily constructed fleet of vessels. Shipwrights from his Mediterranean contingents, working with local craftsmen, built nearly 2,000 boats, ranging from massive troop transports to small scouting craft. This improvised navy carried the bulk of the army downstream, while cavalry and light infantry units marched along the riverbanks, subduing territories as they progressed. As the fleet moved southward, Alexander continued his pattern of alternating diplomacy with overwhelming force. Kingdoms that accepted his authority received favorable treatment, while those that resisted faced the full might of his veteran army. The Malians, who mounted the most determined resistance, nearly changed the course of history when a defender's arrow penetrated Alexander's chest during an assault on their chief city. The wound, among the most serious he had yet sustained, punctured a lung and left him hovering between life and death for days. Alexander's recovery from this wound attained legendary status among his troops. Against medical advice, he insisted on showing himself to the army as soon as he could stand, understanding that rumors of his death would devastate morale and potentially trigger widespread revolts throughout his tenuous empire. This public appearance, though briefly reassuring to his men, masked a significant reduction in his physical capabilities. The accumulated toll of numerous wounds and years of campaign hardships had begun to undermine the superhuman vitality that had defined his leadership. Reaching the Indus Delta, Alexander encountered the Indian Ocean, the southern boundary of the known world to Greek geography. Here, his scientific curiosity manifested in a comprehensive exploration of tidal patterns previously unknown in the tideless Mediterranean. The army's first experience with the powerful tides of the Indian Ocean proved nearly catastrophic, as beached ships were suddenly lifted and damaged by rising waters that seemed miraculous to those without experience of such phenomena. At this juncture, Alexander divided his forces for the return journey westward. The fleet under Nearchus would explore the coastal route toward the Persian Gulf, charting unknown waters and establishing potential maritime trade routes between India and Mesopotamia. Alexander himself would lead the main army overland through the Gedrosian Desert, modern Makran in Pakistan and Iran, a harsh route chosen deliberately to surpass the achievements of mythical predecessors like Semiramis and Cyrus, who had reportedly failed to cross this forbidding terrain. The Gedrosian crossing became the most devastating phase of Alexander's entire expedition. Ancient sources describe an apocalyptic journey through waterless wastes where the sun baked the sand hot enough to blister feet through sandals. Water sources proved few and often inadequate for an army numbering in the tens of thousands. Flash floods in narrow canyons swept away pack animals and soldiers. Food supplies dwindled, forcing troops to eat their own transport animals and eventually discard precious plunder to continue the march. Modern historians debate whether Alexander fully understood the desert's dangers or deliberately chose this route as a final test of endurance, perhaps even as punishment for the army's refusal to continue eastward. Whatever his motivation, the consequences proved catastrophic. Ancient accounts suggest that 3/4 of the civilian followers and a significant portion of the combat troops perished during this 60-day crossing, primarily from thirst, heatstroke, and starvation. Throughout this ordeal, Alexander displayed both remarkable leadership and troubling detachment. He reportedly shared the worst hardships, marching on foot alongside his struggling soldiers and refusing water brought specifically for him. Yet he also maintained elements of Persian royal protocol, traveling with a core elite while thousands perished around them. This tension between shared suffering and privileged position reflected the increasingly complex nature of his authority, simultaneously comrade in arms and divine monarch. Upon finally reaching the relatively fertile region of Carmania, modern southern Iran, Alexander allowed his surviving forces extended rest while re-establishing contact with his satraps and governors. Here he received disturbing reports of widespread corruption, abuse of power, and outright rebellion among officials he had appointed to govern in his absence. The years-long separation from direct oversight had tempted many administrators to treat their provinces as personal fiefdoms, extorting wealth and ruling tyrannically, while assuming their distant king would never return from the east. Alexander's response to these administrative failures combined calculated mercy with spectacular punishment. Officials who had maintained proper governance received elaborate rewards and expanded responsibilities. Those found guilty of the worst abuses faced public execution as examples to others. This pattern of extreme punishment for selected offenders, while pardoning others, created an atmosphere of uncertainty that reinforced absolute dependence on the king's personal favor. A governance style that maintained immediate control but undermined institutional stability. Meanwhile, Nearchus and the fleet completed their own extraordinary journey along the desolate Makran coast, facing severe shortages of water and supplies that nearly forced them to abandon the mission. Their eventual arrival in Susa completed a maritime exploration of revolutionary importance for ancient geography and commerce. Alexander celebrated this achievement with special honors for Nearchus, recognizing the scientific and economic potential of the new sea roads connecting his eastern and western territories. The reunification of Alexander's forces in Persia marked the beginning of a new phase in his imperial project. Having completed the largest conquest in history to that point, he now turned his formidable energy toward consolidating his gains and transforming temporary military control into sustainable governance. The challenges of this transition, from conqueror to administrator, from general to emperor, would test Alexander's abilities in entirely new ways. Beyond the dramatic battles and conquests that dominate accounts of the great conqueror's career, his administrative innovations represented achievements of equal historical significance. The challenge he faced was unprecedented, creating governance systems capable of uniting territories spanning 3 continents, incorporating dozens of languages, religions, and cultural traditions, while maintaining the loyalty of both conquered populations and his own Macedonian Greek ruling elite. The foundation of the Macedonian rulers' administrative approach built upon the existing Persian satrapy system rather than imposing entirely new structures. The Persian Empire had developed sophisticated provincial governance over centuries, and the pragmatic king recognized the value of these established arrangements. However, he modified the system in crucial ways that reflected his particular vision and addressed weaknesses revealed during his campaigns. Most significantly, the young monarch divided authority within each province between multiple officials, rather than concentrating power in a single satrap. Military commanders, financial administrators, and civil governors shared responsibility, creating checks and balances that limited the potential for rebellion or corruption. This division prevented any individual from developing an independent power base that might challenge central authority, a lesson the astute leader had learned from the rebellious tendencies of Persian satraps during his invasion. The selection of officials reflected the conqueror's evolving approach to cultural integration. In the empire's western regions, he initially replaced Persian governors with Macedonians and Greeks, establishing direct control during the conquest phase. As his vision evolved, he increasingly appointed Persian and other local elites to administrative positions, particularly in civil governance and financial management, where their knowledge of local conditions proved invaluable. This hybrid approach balanced the security advantages of loyal Macedonian military commanders with the practical benefits of experienced local administrators. Beyond provincial governance, the empire builder implemented wide-reaching initiatives that facilitated integration across his vast domains. The introduction of a standardized currency system based on the Attic weight standard created a unified economic sphere stretching from Greece to India. This standardization dramatically simplified taxation, trade, and military logistics, while symbolically asserting the unity of previously separate regions. Infrastructure development represented another focus of the royal administration. The Persian royal road network, already impressive in its extent, received significant expansion and improvement under his direction. New roads connected previously isolated regions. Bridges spanned major rivers, and way stations provided secure rest points at regular intervals. These improvements served immediate military purposes, while facilitating the commercial exchange that would eventually become the lifeblood of the Hellenistic world. Perhaps most revolutionary was the ambitious city-founding program, which established dozens of new urban centers throughout the conquered territories. While historians debate the exact number of cities founded, ancient claims of 70 or more appear exaggerated. At least 20 major settlements can be confidently attributed to his reign. These cities served multiple functions simultaneously: military garrisons, administrative centers, commercial hubs, and crucibles of cultural fusion. Alexandria in Egypt exemplified the ambition and foresight of these urban foundations. Located with careful attention to maritime access, agricultural hinterland, and defensive positioning, the city was designed from inception to become a major Mediterranean center. The visionary founder personally approved its distinctive grid plan and designated locations for major public buildings, temples, and markets. Within a generation, this planned city would grow into the preeminent cultural and commercial hub of the Eastern Mediterranean. Similar care went into the placement of other Alexandrias in Central Asia, each positioned along trade routes to facilitate both military control and economic development. These cities typically received initial populations combining Macedonian veterans, Greek merchants, and local inhabitants, creating instant multicultural communities that served as points of Hellenistic influence while adapting to indigenous conditions. The administrative management of such diverse populations required innovative approaches to law and governance. The pragmatic ruler generally maintained local legal systems for issues among indigenous populations while establishing Greek-style civic institutions for the new mixed urban communities. This pragmatic legal pluralism allowed different communities to maintain cultural practices while gradually increasing interaction through commerce and civic participation. Economic development received particular attention as the far-sighted strategist recognized that prosperity would cement loyalty more effectively than military garrisons alone. He initiated major irrigation projects in Mesopotamia, restoring systems that had deteriorated under later Persian rule. In Egypt, he launched surveys for a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, a project later completed by his successor Ptolemy. These investments in productive infrastructure reflected a long-term vision extending beyond immediate resource extraction. Scientific and intellectual developments formed another dimension of the imperial legacy. The Eastern campaigns included scientists, historians, and philosophers whose systematic observations transformed Greek knowledge of geography, botany, zoology, and ethnography. This intellectual windfall laid the groundwork for the scientific flowering of the Hellenistic era, particularly at the great research center and library later established in Alexandria. Census taking and record keeping expanded dramatically under the new administration, reflecting both military planning needs and governance requirements. Royal secretaries documented population figures, agricultural production, and resource availability throughout the conquered territories, creating unprecedented knowledge resources for rational governance. This systematic approach to information gathering represented a significant advance in administrative technique. For all its innovations, the administrative system contained fundamental tensions and contradictions. The division of authority between multiple officials, while effective at preventing rebellion, created coordination challenges and jurisdictional conflicts. The balance between Macedonian Greek and indigenous administrators generated cultural frictions despite attempts at integration. Most significantly, the entire system remained highly centralized around the charismatic leader's personal authority. lacking institutional mechanisms to ensure stability beyond his direct oversight. These administrative arrangements, impressive in their scope and sophistication, ultimately faced the greatest test any imperial system can encounter: the sudden loss of its central authority. The empire builder's premature death would reveal both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of his governance vision. As the administrative structures he created struggled to withstand the centrifugal forces of ambition and regional identity without the binding force of his charismatic leadership. Behind the thunder of the Macedonian conquests ran a quieter current of discovery and knowledge gathering that would transform humanity's understanding of the world. The king who had studied under Aristotle never lost his intellectual curiosity, even amid the pressures of commanding history's most ambitious military expedition. This scientific dimension of his campaigns, though often overshadowed by military achievements, produced lasting contributions across multiple fields of knowledge. The expedition included formal scientific personnel, botanists, zoologists, geographers, and historians tasked with documenting discoveries. Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, initially served as official historian before his execution following the page's conspiracy. Others, like Nearchus and Onesicratus, recorded geographical and ethnographic observations during their naval explorations. These systematic efforts to document new findings distinguished the great conqueror's campaigns from mere conquest, adding a dimension of intellectual exploration. Geography represented perhaps the most dramatically affected field. Prior to the Eastern campaigns, Greek geographical knowledge became increasingly speculative beyond the familiar Mediterranean basin. The Caspian Sea was believed to connect to an outer ocean encircling the world. India existed as a semi-mythical land of wonders, rather than a concrete geographical entity. The expeditions systematically corrected these misconceptions through direct observation and measurement. Engineers and surveyors measured distances traveled, recorded terrain features, and documented river systems throughout the conquered territories. The Baematists, or steppe measurers, who accompanied the army, maintained precise records of distances between significant locations, creating the first accurately measured land routes across Asia. These records, later incorporated into the geographical works of Eratosthenes and ultimately Ptolemy, transformed abstract space into precisely measured territory. Naval exploration produced equally significant geographical knowledge. Nearchus's voyage from the Indus Delta to the Persian Gulf charted previously unknown coastlines and corrected fundamental misconceptions about the Indian Ocean. The Macedonian fleet's observations of tidal patterns, prevailing winds, and coastal features laid the groundwork for maritime trade routes that would flourish in subsequent centuries, connecting the Mediterranean world with India and points beyond. Biological sciences advanced dramatically through the Eastern campaigns. Hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to Greek science were documented, collected, and in some cases transported live to Mediterranean regions. Aristotle's groundbreaking zoological works benefited directly from specimens the young ruler sent back, expanding the empirical foundation for biological classification. Similarly, botanical knowledge expanded through systematic collection of medicinal herbs, cultivated crops, and exotic plants from regions as diverse as the Hindu Kush mountains and tropical Indian forests. Medical knowledge advanced through practical necessity as the expedition encountered new diseases, injuries, and healing practices across diverse environments. The sovereign's personal physician, Philip, gained fame for saving the king's life after he contracted a severe illness from bathing in the cold Cydnus River. Other medical practitioners accompanying the expedition, documented indigenous treatments, surgical techniques, and medicinal substances, incorporating effective approaches into Greek medical practice while recording observations for future study. Ethnography, the systematic study of human cultures, emerged as a distinct intellectual pursuit during these campaigns. Greek observers documented social practices, religious beliefs, political systems, and economic activities of dozens of previously unknown peoples. Though often filtered through Hellenic cultural biases, these observations nevertheless produced a substantially more accurate understanding of human diversity than previous Greek conceptions, which had simply divided the world into Hellenes and undifferentiated barbarians. Astronomical observations made during the campaigns confirmed and extended existing Greek knowledge, while incorporating Babylonian and Indian contributions. The expedition's passage through different latitudes allowed confirmation of Earth's curvature through observations of changing star positions. In Babylon, the curious leader ordered the translation of astronomical records dating back centuries, preserving this accumulated knowledge and making it available to Greek researchers who would later develop more sophisticated celestial models. Technological innovation flourished as the expedition faced unprecedented challenges requiring novel solutions. Siege operations against seemingly impregnable positions like Tyre and the Sogdian Rock produced revolutionary approaches to engineering problems. The rapid construction of Alexandria in Egypt demonstrated advanced urban planning techniques. Naval construction in regions without shipbuilding traditions showcased adaptive engineering approaches. These practical innovations, driven by immediate military and administrative needs, advanced technical knowledge applicable across multiple fields. Linguistic studies advanced through necessity as the conquests encompassed dozens of language groups. Translators and interpreters within the army developed systematic approaches to bridging communication gaps. The expedition's scribes documented unfamiliar writing systems and vocabularies, particularly from the Indian subcontinent. Though not formally theoretical, this practical engagement with linguistic diversity expanded Greek understanding of language itself, beyond their previous limited exposure to neighboring tongues. The world conqueror's personal interest in natural phenomena manifested in specific research initiatives amid the campaigns. When floods threatened his army in India, he conducted systematic investigations of monsoon patterns. Encountering crocodiles in the Indus River system prompted comparative studies with their Egyptian counterparts. Upon reaching the Indian Ocean, he ordered detailed documentation of marine life not found in Mediterranean waters. These targeted inquiries reflected both practical concerns and intellectual curiosity. Perhaps most significant was the Macedonian king's role in facilitating intellectual exchange between previously separate knowledge traditions. Greek natural philosophy encountered Babylonian mathematical astronomy, Indian medical practices, Persian administrative techniques, and Egyptian architectural knowledge. While full synthesis of these traditions would require generations, the conquests initiated conversations between intellectual systems that had developed largely in isolation from one another. This scientific legacy continued beyond the great general's lifetime through institutions established in his wake. The Library of Alexandria, founded by his successor Ptolemy I, became the ancient world's preeminent research center, housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls from across the known world. The associated Macedonia gathered scholars who systematized and extended the knowledge gathered during the campaigns. Similar, though smaller intellectual centers in Antioch, Pergamon, and other Hellenistic cities created an unprecedented network of knowledge sharing across the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Thus, alongside the political map transformed by his conquests, the visionary ruler helped redraw humanity's intellectual map of the world. Lands that had existed only as rumor became concrete reality. Peoples known only through travelers' tales became documented subjects of systematic study. Plants, animals, and natural phenomena, previously unknown, entered the catalogue of scientific knowledge. This intellectual dimension of his achievements, though less dramatic than battlefield victories, arguably produced more enduring effects on human civilization. The return to Babylon in the spring of his final year represented both a triumphant homecoming and the beginning of the great conqueror's last chapter. This ancient city, reclaimed from Persian rule 7 years earlier, had been designated as his imperial capital, a symbolic middle ground between East and West. Its massive walls and towering ziggurats created an imposing backdrop for what the visionary ruler envisioned as the administrative heart of his new world order. The arrival itself generated considerable drama. Babylonian priests and astrologers reportedly warned the Macedonian king against entering the city from the east, citing ominous omens. Some accounts claim ravens fighting and falling dead at his feet further troubled his typically pragmatic approach to superstition. Despite these warnings, he entered Babylon with characteristic determination, though perhaps with uncharacteristic unease. Within the ancient city's walls, the world ruler found an empire simultaneously at its zenith and facing fundamental challenges. The territorial extent of his dominion surpassed anything previously achieved in Mediterranean history. From the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River, from the steppes beyond the Caspian to the cataracts of the Nile, diverse peoples acknowledged his authority. Yet this vast realm remained an assemblage of conquered territories, rather than a coherent political entity with stable institutions and clear succession principles. The sovereign devoted his final months to addressing these foundational challenges. Administrative reforms accelerated, with comprehensive reviews of satrapal governance and systematic replacement of officials who had abused their positions during his eastern campaigns. Records suggest he personally reviewed thousands of petitions and reports, working to establish more consistent governance practices across his diverse territories. Simultaneously, the ambitious monarch launched new infrastructure projects. Engineers began surveys for a massive harbour at Babylon, capable of hosting 1,000 warships. Irrigation systems neglected during years of war received attention, with plans to restore agricultural productivity throughout Mesopotamia. Road improvements connected previously isolated regions, furthering the integration of his sprawling dominions. Most significantly, the restless leader unveiled plans for new military campaigns that revealed the still expanding scope of his ambition. Primary among these was a planned invasion of Arabia, targeting the incense-producing regions along the peninsula's southern coast. Preparations for this expedition had reached advanced stages, with naval vessels constructed, troops assembled, and reconnaissance completed along potential invasion routes. Beyond Arabia loomed even more ambitious targets. Ancient sources suggest the Macedonian commander contemplated campaigns against Carthage and the Western Mediterranean, which would have brought him into direct conflict with the rising power of Rome. Other accounts mention plans to circumnavigate Africa or explore the Caspian Sea region. Whether practical intentions or speculative discussions, these considerations reflected a mind still oriented toward expansion rather than consolidation. The human dimension of this final period reveals a leader increasingly isolated, despite being surrounded by courtiers and administrators. The death of Hephaestion the previous year had deprived him of his closest companion and most trusted confidant. His grief had manifested in extreme behaviors: the crucifixion of Hephaestion's physician, elaborate funeral ceremonies, and petitions to oracles seeking to have his friend declared a god. Without Hephaestion's moderating influence, the grieving ruler displayed increasing volatility. Drinking bouts became more frequent and extreme, sometimes lasting multiple days and culminating in troubling episodes of violence or bizarre behavior. Contemporary accounts describe a man oscillating between feverish administrative activity and periods of withdrawal or excessive indulgence, suggesting psychological instability exacerbated by years of combat stress and accumulated injuries. Relations with his Macedonian veteran corps grew increasingly strained. The arrival of 30,000 Persian youths trained in Macedonian military techniques symbolized the king's vision of a multinational empire, but threatened the privileged position of his original followers. When he incorporated these successors, as he called them, into the army's elite units, traditional Macedonians saw their unique relationship with their monarch further diluted. The emperor's final known public appearance occurred at a massive banquet, honoring the resolution of a mutiny among these Macedonian veterans. After initially reacting with fury to their protests, he had adopted a more conciliatory approach, arranging what ancient sources call a banquet of reconciliation. There, thousands of Macedonians and Persians dined together, while the great unifier offered his famous prayer for homonoia, unity of minds, between the peoples of his empire. Days after this apparently successful reconciliation, the ailing sovereign attended a smaller drinking party at the home of his friend Medius of Larissa. According to the so-called royal diaries cited by ancient historians, he drank heavily into the night, then was struck by a sudden pain so severe he cried out. Carried to his bed in the royal palace, he developed a high fever that would persist for the next 11 days. As the condition of the stricken ruler deteriorated, public anxiety mounted. Macedonian soldiers demanded to see their king, fearing reports of his illness were being concealed. Allowed to file past his sickbed, they found him unable to speak, but still conscious enough to acknowledge them with slight movements of his head and eyes. The sight of their seemingly invincible leader, rendered helpless, reportedly moved many hardened veterans to tears. The precise nature of the final illness remains one of history's enduring medical mysteries. Theories range from typhoid fever, malaria, or West Nile virus to acute pancreatitis triggered by alcohol abuse. More sensational accounts suggest poisoning, possibly involving the toxic water of the Styx River, allegedly carried to Babylon, specifically to assassinate the world conqueror. Modern analyses of the symptoms described in ancient sources favor infectious disease, complicated by his previous injuries and compromised immune system. On the evening of June 10th, 323 BCE, in his 33rd year, Alexander of Macedon died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II. In his 13-year reign, he had never suffered a major military defeat, had founded over 20 cities, and had created an empire spanning 3 million square miles. He left behind no designated heir, though his wife Roxana was pregnant with their first child. When asked to whom he left his kingdom, the dying king reportedly whispered, "To the strongest, Kratisto." Though whether this represented a deliberate statement, a misunderstanding of difficult speech, or later fabrication remains debated. Other accounts claim his final words were instructions regarding his funeral arrangements or acknowledgement that the gods were reclaiming him. As news of the great conqueror's death spread through Babylon, the city fell into stunned silence before erupting into expressions of grief across its diverse population. For 6 days, his body remained untreated while his generals debated funeral arrangements and, more urgently, the future governance of an empire suddenly deprived of its center. Even in death, the Macedonian king's physical presence commanded attention, lying in state while the future of his conquests hung in precarious balance. The succession crisis that followed Alexander's death revealed the fundamental weakness at the heart of his imperial project, its complete dependence on his personal authority and charisma. Without clear designation of an heir or established institutional mechanisms for transferring power, the vast empire he had assembled through military genius now faced imminent fragmentation. In the immediate aftermath of Alexander's death, his senior commanders gathered in Babylon's royal palace to determine next steps. The situation presented unprecedented complications. Roxana was pregnant with Alexander's child, but the baby's gender remained unknown. Alexander's half-brother, Aridaeus, while having royal blood, suffered from a cognitive disability that rendered him incapable of independent rule. No surviving relative possessed both the bloodline and capability to assume immediate leadership of the empire. The Council of Generals split into factions. Perdiccas, holder of Alexander's signet ring and commander of the elite cavalry, advocated waiting for Roxana's child, who might provide a legitimate heir if male. Ptolemy proposed a collective leadership council of senior commanders, effectively dividing authority while maintaining nominal unity. Meleager, speaking for the infantry, supported Aridaeus as the adult male with the closest blood claim. Nearchus suggested considering Alexander's son by his Persian wife Barsine, though this child lacked official recognition. After heated debates and growing tensions between infantry and cavalry units, a compromise emerged. Aridaeus would become King Philip III, while if Roxana's child proved male, he would become co-king as Alexander IV. Perdiccas would serve as regent for both kings, effectively controlling imperial administration. This arrangement satisfied immediate concerns for preserving unity, while deferring the fundamental question of who would ultimately inherit Alexander's power. The fragile compromise soon collapsed into open conflict. Within days, Meleager led infantry units in an attempted coup against Perdiccas and the cavalry faction. After initial bloodshed, Perdiccas outmaneuvered his rival through a combination of negotiation and treachery, eventually executing Meleager and 30 of his supporters during a purported religious ceremony of army purification. With internal opposition temporarily suppressed, the generals proceeded to divide administrative responsibilities while maintaining the fiction of a unified empire. In the settlement known as the Partition of Babylon, Ptolemy secured Egypt. Lysimachus received Thrace. Antigonus gained control of Phrygia. Eumenes was assigned Cappadocia, and other commanders received various provinces according to their status and negotiating leverage. Perdiccas retained central authority as regent, with the boy kings serving as symbols of legitimacy rather than exercise of actual power. As these political maneuvers unfolded, Alexander's body became the focus of competing claims. Traditional Macedonian practice would have called for burial at the royal tombs at Aegae. However, Ptolemy intercepted the funeral procession, diverting Alexander's remains to Egypt in a move that simultaneously honored the conqueror's apparent wish to be buried at the Oracle of Amun and secured a powerful symbol of legitimacy for Ptolemy's rule. The elaborate funerary carriage that transported Alexander's body became legendary in itself. Ancient sources describe a marvel of engineering and artistic splendor. Gold-plated wheels, an architectural chamber decorated with precious stones, golden lions guarding the entrance, and a roof adorned with symbols of his conquests. This mobile monument journeyed from Babylon toward Egypt, its passage marking the physical dispersal of Alexander's presence even as his empire began its political fragmentation. Meanwhile, The human consequences of Alexander's death unfolded with brutal efficiency. In Babylon, many Persian nobles who had allied themselves with Alexander now faced uncertain futures as Macedonian factions prioritized their own interests. In Macedonia, Alexander's mother, Olympias, maneuvered to secure the interests of her unborn grandson against rivals. Most tragically, within the royal family itself, a deadly purge eliminated potential competitors to the designated heirs. Roxana, perhaps with Perdiccas's knowledge or assistance, arranged the murder of Alexander's other wife, Statera, daughter of Darius, and her sister, eliminating potential rival bloodlines. Alexander's illegitimate son, by Barcine, similarly disappeared from historical record, presumably eliminated to consolidate claims around the official heirs. These killings revealed how quickly Alexander's vision of Persian-Macedonian fusion collapsed when his personal authority vanished. Roxana eventually delivered a healthy son who was proclaimed Alexander IV. However, neither he nor Philip III Aridaeus exercised actual power, serving instead as pawns in the power struggles of the generals. The regency itself became contested, with Perdiccas facing increasing opposition from other territorial rulers who resented his claims to central authority. The fiction of imperial unity dissolved completely within 3 years of Alexander's death. Perdiccas's attempt to assert control through military action against Ptolemy ended in his assassination by his own officers. Subsequent attempts to maintain a unified empire under different leadership similarly failed, as centrifugal forces of regional interest and personal ambition proved stronger than diminishing loyalty to Alexander's memory or his bloodline. The ultimate fate of Alexander's family unfolded as a Greek tragedy. Philip III Aridaeus and his wife Eurydice were executed on Olympias's orders during her brief period of control in Macedonia. Olympias herself was subsequently killed by Cassander, son of Antipater, after her forces abandoned her. Finally, the teenage Alexander IV and his mother Roxana were secretly murdered by Cassander around 310 BCE, effectively extinguishing the Argead bloodline that had ruled Macedonia for centuries. With Alexander's genetic heirs eliminated, his empire transformed into separate kingdoms ruled by his former generals: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia, and other smaller states. Though these successor kingdoms maintained many of Alexander's administrative innovations and cultural policies, they operated as independent entities, increasingly focused on competition rather than common heritage. Alexander's physical remains, meanwhile, became a legitimizing symbol for the Ptolemaic dynasty. Transferred from Memphis to Alexandria, his tomb became a site of pilgrimage for Romans and others for centuries afterward. Julius Caesar, Augustus, Septimius Severus, and Caracalla all reportedly visited to pay respects to the conqueror, whose achievements set a standard few could hope to approach. The eventual disappearance of this tomb, sometime in late antiquity, added a final layer of mystery to Alexander's already legendary life. The rapid disintegration of Alexander's political achievement might suggest failure of his broader vision. Yet viewing the succession crisis solely through this lens misses the more profound transformations his conquests initiated. While the empire fractured politically, the cultural synthesis he envisioned took root throughout the successor kingdoms, creating a Hellenistic civilization that would transform the Mediterranean world and beyond for centuries to come. The decades following Alexander's death witnessed political chaos that would have horrified the architect of unity and fusion. His empire, assembled through 13 years of brilliant campaigning, unraveled with shocking speed as his former generals, Men who had once shared hardship and triumph under his command, transformed into ruthless competitors for territory and power. These wars of the Diadochi, successors in Greek, unfolded across 3 continents in a series of shifting alliances, betrayals, and battlefield confrontations. The conflict's scale and complexity dwarfed even the Persian wars that had once defined Greek historical consciousness. Where Alexander had conquered through strategic genius and coherent vision, his successors fought with desperate pragmatism, each seeking to maximize their individual share rather than preserve the whole. Antigonus, One Eye, emerged initially as the most ambitious claimant, attempting to reconstitute Alexander's empire under his own leadership. His efforts triggered coalitions of rival generals determined to preserve their autonomy. After years of inconclusive warfare, the aging general and his son Demetrius made a final bid for dominance at the Battle of Ipsus. There, the combined forces of Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander defeated Antigonus, who fell on the battlefield at 81 years of age. The victors divided Antigonus's territories among themselves, further consolidating the fragmentation of Alexander's realm into distinct kingdoms. Cassander secured Macedonia and control of Greece. Lysimachus dominated Thrace and Western Asia Minor. Seleucus claimed the vast eastern territories stretching toward India, while Ptolemy, who had wisely avoided the final confrontation, strengthened his hold on Egypt and adjacent regions. These successor kingdoms, though politically separate, preserved elements of Alexander's administrative innovations and cultural vision. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt maintained his policy of respecting indigenous religious traditions while establishing Greek-speaking administrative elite. The Seleucid Empire continued his practice of founding Greek-style cities throughout Asia, creating centers of Hellenic culture in regions previously untouched by Greek influence. Even in Macedonia, now ruled by the Antigonid dynasty established by Antigonus's descendants, Alexander's military innovations remained the foundation of armed forces. For the common inhabitants of these regions, the transition often brought more continuity than disruption. Persian satraps were replaced by Macedonian governors who employed similar administrative methods. Tax collection, military service, and agricultural production continued under new oversight but familiar structures. Local elites who had accommodated themselves to Persian authority now adapted to Macedonian rule, often finding opportunities in the expanding trade networks that connected formerly separate regions. The fate of Alexander's family provides a sobering counterpoint to this administrative continuity. His posthumous son, Alexander IV, spent his brief life as a political pawn, never exercising the power that was nominally his by birthright. As the wars of the Diadochi intensified, the boy king and his mother, Roxana, became increasingly inconvenient for Cassander, who controlled Macedonia. Around 310 BCE, as Alexander IV approached adolescence and might soon claim actual authority, Cassander reportedly ordered their secret execution. Olympias, Alexander's formidable mother, who had done so much to shape his sense of destiny, met an equally tragic end. After temporarily seizing control in Macedonia and ordering the execution of Philip III Aridaeus and his wife, she found herself besieged by Cassander's forces at Pydna. When her supporters abandoned her, Olympias faced death with characteristic defiance, demanding proper trial rather than assassination. Cassander denied this dignity, having her executed by relatives of her previous victims. Within a single generation of Alexander's death, his bloodline had been systematically erased from the political landscape. Yet the administrative, military, and cultural systems he had established or transformed continued functioning under new leadership. This paradox The immediate collapse of Alexander's political achievement, alongside the enduring influence of his institutional legacy, defined the transition from his brief rule to the Hellenistic age that followed. Even in death, Alexander's physical remains became objects of political competition. Ptolemy's hijacking of the funeral cortege to secure the conqueror's body for Egypt represented more than symbolic triumph. The magnificent tomb, constructed in Alexandria, became a legitimizing monument for the Ptolemaic dynasty, a pilgrimage site that connected Egypt's new rulers to Alexander's unmatched prestige. Roman leaders would later visit this tomb, with Augustus reportedly accidentally breaking the preserved nose when he bent to kiss the face of history's greatest conqueror. Though politically fragmented, the world Alexander left behind retained crucial connective tissue that prevented complete dissolution. Greek served as a common administrative language across successor kingdoms, facilitating diplomatic communication and commercial exchange. Macedonian military techniques provided standardized approaches to warfare that shaped conflicts throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Cultural practices introduced during Alexander's campaigns, from administrative procedures to architectural styles, created recognizable patterns from the Adriatic to the Indus. Most significantly, the shattered empire maintained extensive trade networks that bound former provinces into an interconnected economic zone. Goods, people, and ideas flowed more freely across political boundaries than they had before Alexander's conquests. Greek merchants established trading communities in Egyptian Alexandria, Babylonian Seleucia, and cities along the Central Asian Silk routes. Eastern luxury products reached Mediterranean markets in unprecedented quantities, while Greek wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods traveled eastward. This economic integration created powerful incentives for maintaining aspects of Alexander's legacy, even as political unity disintegrated. Commercial elites benefited from standardized currency, predictable legal frameworks for contracts, and improved transportation infrastructure initially established under Alexander's authority. These practical advantages ensured that while the empire could not survive intact, neither would it completely disappear. Instead, it transformed into an interconnected system of competing but culturally related states, the defining characteristic of the Hellenistic world. From the ruins of Alexander's short-lived empire emerged a new world order that would shape Mediterranean civilization for 3 centuries. The Hellenistic Age, spanning the period from Alexander's death until Rome's conquest of Ptolemaic Egypt, represented neither simple Greek colonization nor passive absorption of Eastern traditions, but rather a dynamic synthesis creating entirely new cultural forms across art, science, philosophy, religion, and governance. The most visible manifestation of this new civilization appeared in its urban landscapes. Dozens of cities founded during and after Alexander's campaigns served as administrative centers and cultural beacons throughout Asia and North Africa. These urban communities followed Greek architectural models, featuring agoras, theaters, gymnasiums, and colonnaded streets, while adapting to local building materials, climate conditions, and religious requirements. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and Iconium in distant Bactria became microcosms of cultural fusion. Alexandria exemplified the creative potential of this synthesis. Built on a carefully selected Mediterranean site with excellent harbor potential, the city combined Greek urban planning with Egyptian religious elements and practical innovations addressing local conditions. Its famous lighthouse, the Pharos, represented both engineering achievement and multicultural symbolism. The library and museum, established by Ptolemy I, created institutional support for intellectual exchange on an unprecedented scale, gathering scholars from across the known world. This Alexandrian intellectual community produced revolutionary advances across multiple fields. Euclid systematized mathematical knowledge in his Elements, establishing axioms and proofs that would define geometry for 2 millennia. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, using observations at different latitudes. Herophilus performed human dissections, dramatically advancing anatomical understanding beyond previous theoretical speculation. These achievements rested on the cosmopolitan foundation Alexander had established, bringing diverse knowledge traditions into productive conversation. Artistic developments paralleled these intellectual advances. Hellenistic sculpture departed from classical Greek ideals, embracing emotional expressiveness, anatomical realism, and subjects previously considered unsuitable for high art. The Dying Gaul, Laocoon group, and Venus de Milo exemplified this new aesthetic sensibility, which influenced artistic production from Greece to northwestern India. In painting, techniques for creating perspective and modeling, three-dimensional forms advanced significantly, though few examples survive beyond descriptions in literary sources. Literature transformed through exposure to Eastern narrative traditions and new social realities. The pastoral poetry of Theocritus, the sophisticated court poetry of Callimachus, and the urban comedies of Menander reflected changing relationships between individuals and their communities. Alexandria's library fostered critical scholarship, examining canonical texts, establishing philology and literary criticism as systematic disciplines. Meanwhile, translated works from Babylonian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions entered Greek consciousness, expanding literary possibilities. Philosophy responded to these changed circumstances, with new schools addressing individual well-being amid political uncertainty. Epicureanism advocated withdrawal into private contentment. Stoicism promoted virtue, regardless of external circumstances. Skepticism questioned the possibility of certain knowledge. These philosophical approaches, focused on practical ethics rather than abstract metaphysics, offered guidance for navigating a world where traditional city-state relationships had collapsed into vast kingdoms governed by distant monarchs. Religion underwent particularly dynamic transformations. Greek deities found identification with local gods throughout Alexander's former territories. Zeus with Amun, Aphrodite with Ishtar, Dionysus with various vegetation deities. Mystery cults offering personal salvation and emotional experience gained popularity across ethnic boundaries. Egyptian Isis worship spread throughout the Mediterranean, while Eastern astrological practices gained scientific prestige through Babylonian mathematical precision. These religious developments created shared spiritual vocabulary across formerly separate traditions. Governance during this period reflected both Alexander's innovations and practical adaptations by his successors. The Ptolemaic administration in Egypt maintained centralized control through sophisticated bureaucracy, census records, and tax systems that combined Greek record-keeping with pharaonic traditions. The Seleucid Empire, governing more diverse territories, balanced central authority with regional autonomy for different ethnic and religious communities. These administrative systems, though imperfect and often exploitative, nevertheless represented advances in governing complex multicultural societies. Economic integration accelerated throughout the Hellenistic world, despite political fragmentation. Standardized coinage facilitated trade across boundaries, while improved harbor facilities and road networks reduced transportation costs. Banking systems became more sophisticated, offering credit instruments that supported long-distance commerce. Agricultural innovations spread between regions, introducing new crops and cultivation techniques that improved productivity. These economic developments created prosperity, that funded cultural achievements while binding diverse regions together through commercial relationships. Scientific and technological progress characterized this period across multiple fields. Military engineering advanced with innovations like the polybolos, repeating ballista, and improved siege engines. Water management techniques spread from regions with ancient expertise to areas previously lacking sophisticated irrigation. Mechanical devices reached new levels of complexity, exemplified by Archimedes' inventions and astronomical calculating devices like the Antikythera mechanism. These practical innovations improved quality of life while demonstrating the creative potential of cultural exchange. On society's margins, unprecedented opportunities sometimes emerged for previously excluded groups. Women in some Hellenistic cities gained access to education and cultural participation beyond what had been possible in classical Greek polis. Prominent female intellectuals like Hypatia of Alexandria and poets like Irina and Gnosis demonstrated women's capabilities when given opportunities for development. Though patriarchal structures remained dominant, the disruption of traditional social arrangements created occasional openings for exceptional individuals, regardless of gender. Geographic mobility characterized Hellenistic society across all social classes. Professional soldiers, merchants, scholars, and administrators traveled extensively throughout the connected regions, sometimes settling permanently far from their birthplaces. This movement created cosmopolitan populations in major cities, where diverse languages, customs, and religious practices coexisted in dynamic tension. While ethnic identity remained important, opportunities for cross-cultural friendships, marriages, and business partnerships increased dramatically. The Hellenistic synthesis reached its geographic limits in encounters with civilizations beyond Alexander's conquests. In the West, expanding Roman power gradually absorbed Greek colonies in Italy and Sicily before directly confronting the successor kingdoms. To the east, the Indian Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta and later Ashoka established boundaries through both military confrontation and diplomatic exchange with Seleucid rulers. In Central Asia, nomadic peoples like the Scythians and rising powers like Parthia created frontiers where Hellenistic influence diminished with distance. This remarkable civilization, simultaneously Greek and not Greek, maintaining cultural continuity while embracing unprecedented diversity, represented Alexander's most enduring achievement. Though his political unity proved ephemeral, the cultural fusion he initiated transformed Mediterranean and West Asian civilization permanently. The Hellenistic world he made possible would eventually be absorbed by Rome politically, but its intellectual, artistic, and religious developments would shape Roman civilization, and through it, the subsequent development of Western culture. Few historical figures have generated such diverse and contradictory interpretations across civilizations as Alexander. In the centuries and millennia following his death, cultures throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa developed distinct perspectives on the Macedonian conqueror, ranging from idealized hero to destructive demon, each revealing as much about the interpreting culture as about Alexander himself. The Greek tradition, beginning with Alexander's contemporaries, established the foundation for his Western image. Early accounts by Callisthenes before his execution, and later Ptolemy, Nearchus, Aristobulus, and others, provided eyewitness perspectives later synthesized by historians like Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus Siculus. These Greek sources generally portrayed Alexander sympathetically, emphasizing his Philhellenism, personal courage, and vision of cultural unity. His excessive drinking, growing Orientalism, and brutal punishments of opposition were acknowledged but often contextualized as understandable responses to extraordinary pressures. Roman interpretations built upon these Greek accounts while adapting Alexander to specifically Roman concerns. For ambitious generals like Pompey and Caesar, Alexander provided both inspiration and competitive standard against which to measure their own achievements. The Emperor Augustus reportedly wept before Alexander's tomb, lamenting that at an age when Alexander had conquered the known world, he himself had accomplished comparatively little. Yet alongside admiration ran a current of moral criticism. Roman writers like Livy cast Alexander as corrupted by luxury and Eastern despotism, a cautionary tale about power without republican restraint. The Persian perspective offers striking contrast to these Western interpretations. In Zoroastrian tradition, Alexander appears as the accursed Alexander, who destroyed sacred texts and fire temples during his conquest. The national epic Shahnameh, though composed centuries after his death, portrays Alexander, Iskandar, as the secret son of the Persian king Darius, a literary device transforming foreign conquest into internal succession while acknowledging the disruptive impact of his campaigns on Persian civilization. Later, Persian traditions partially rehabilitated Alexander, depicting him as a philosopher king seeking wisdom throughout his travels. Perhaps most remarkable is Alexander's transformation in Islamic tradition into Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one mentioned in the Quran. This figure, identified by many commentators with Alexander, travels to the ends of the earth, establishing justice and building a wall to contain the destructive forces of Gog and Magog. This Islamic Alexander becomes a proto-monotheist and righteous ruler whose conquests serve divine purpose, a dramatic reinterpretation that allowed Islamic civilization to incorporate a significant pre-Islamic historical figure into its religious worldview. Indian accounts offer some of the most negative assessments of Alexander's campaigns. While Greek sources portray the Indian expedition as a glorious achievement against exotic adversaries, Sanskrit texts barely mention the Macedonian invasion, treating it as a minor incursion by foreign barbarians, Yavanas, of little historical significance. Modern Indian historians have sometimes characterized Alexander as simply another in a long line of failed invaders who made minimal impact on the subcontinent's fundamental civilization, a perspective that challenges Eurocentric emphasis on his world historical importance. The most extravagant transformations of Alexander's story emerged in medieval European and Middle Eastern romances, collectively known as the Alexander Romance. These narratives, translated and adapted across dozens of languages from Armenian to Ethiopian, incorporated fantastic elements entirely absent from historical accounts: underwater exploration in a primitive submarine, ascent into the heavens using trained griffins, encounters with paradise, and battles against mythical creatures. Alexander became a vessel for exploring human limitations and possibilities, transcending historical specificity to embody universal themes of ambition, discovery, and mortality. Central Asian traditions developed another distinctive interpretation, particularly in regions like Sogdiana, where Alexander had faced fierce resistance. Here, local legends sometimes identified him with ancient mythological figures or depicted him learning wisdom from indigenous sages. The Kyrgyz epic Manas incorporates elements possibly derived from Alexander legends, while Uzbek and Tajik folklore preserve stories of his encounters with regional heroes and holy men. These traditions reflect the complex processes through which conquered peoples assimilated the memory of conquest into their cultural self-understanding. Egyptian interpretations reflected their unique historical position. Alexander had presented himself as liberator from Persian rule and legitimate pharaoh through the oracle at Siwa. Ptolemaic propaganda reinforced this narrative, depicting Alexander with pharaonic regalia and divine attributes in temple reliefs. Egyptian texts, however, treated him primarily as founder of Alexandria and predecessor to the Ptolemaic dynasty, rather than focusing on his personal qualities or achievements. This pragmatic approach reflected Egypt's long experience absorbing foreign conquerors into its ancient cultural framework. These diverse cultural interpretations share certain common elements, despite their differences. Nearly all acknowledge Alexander's extraordinary military achievements, even when condemning their effects. Most attribute to him exceptional personal qualities, courage, intelligence, curiosity, regardless of moral judgments about how he employed these attributes. Perhaps most significantly, cultural traditions consistently use Alexander as a vehicle for exploring fundamental questions about power, ambition, cultural contact, and human limitations. What makes Alexander's cross-cultural reception unique is not merely its diversity, but its sustained relevance across different civilizations. Other conquerors achieved comparable territorial expansion, Genghis Khan, for instance, but generated less varied and persistent cultural interpretation. This enduring fascination suggests Alexander represents something beyond mere military success, a complex symbol of human potential and limitation that resonates across cultural boundaries. A figure whose brief life raised eternal questions about the meaning of achievement and the price of ambition. The shadow of Alexander stretches across history, far beyond the immediate aftermath of his conquests. For 2,000 years, and continuing into our present, his life and achievements have provided inspiration, cautionary examples, and points of comparison for leaders, thinkers, and ordinary people attempting to understand the possibilities and limitations of human action in the world. Military leaders throughout history have studied Alexander's campaigns as masterclasses in strategy, tactics, and leadership. Julius Caesar allegedly wept before a statue of Alexander, lamenting that at an age when the Macedonian had conquered the known world, he himself had achieved comparatively little. Napoleon Bonaparte carried a copy of Arrian's history of Alexander's campaigns throughout his own military career, consciously modeling aspects of his leadership on his ancient predecessor. Modern military academies still analyze the battles of Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela for insights into principles of warfare that transcend technological change. What these military students particularly admire in Alexander's campaigns is not merely tactical brilliance, but operational innovation. His logistics systems enabling sustained operations thousands of miles from home bases. His integration of intelligence gathering with strategic planning. His cultivation of local allies in unfamiliar territories. And his adaptability when facing novel challenges together created a comprehensive approach to warfare that remains relevant despite vast technological changes. Political leaders have drawn different lessons from Alexander's brief reign. For some, like Augustus and later Roman emperors, he provided a model of charismatic authority transcending traditional governmental constraints. Renaissance princes studied his methods of balancing terror with magnanimity when dealing with conquered populations. Modern theorists of international relations find in his empire building both positive models of cultural integration and cautionary examples of unsustainable expansion beyond administrable boundaries. Alexander's approach to cultural difference has generated particularly complex legacy. His policy of incorporating rather than merely subjugating conquered peoples, while maintaining core Macedonian Greek identity at the ruling level, established patterns that influenced subsequent empires from Rome to Britain. The tension between his vision of cultural fusion and the practical maintenance of Macedonian privilege raises questions about power, identity, and cultural exchange that remain relevant in today's globalizing world. Intellectual and artistic engagements with Alexander reveal his persistent grip on human imagination. Literary works from Dante's Divine Comedy to modern novels explore his ambiguous legacy. Visual artists from ancient mosaicists to Renaissance painters to contemporary filmmakers have depicted pivotal moments from his life. The taming of Bucephalus, the Gordian knot, the meeting with Diogenes, as allegories for broader human themes. These artistic interpretations often reveal more about their creators' eras than about Alexander himself, demonstrating his versatility as cultural symbol. Archaeological discoveries continually enrich and sometimes challenge our understanding of Alexander's world. Excavations at Alexandria have revealed aspects of the city's original Hellenistic design beneath later Roman and medieval development. The discovery of the royal tombs at Vagina in Macedonia illuminated the court culture that shaped Alexander's early years. Ongoing work at sites along his campaign route from Turkey to Afghanistan provides material evidence supplementing and sometimes contradicting textual accounts of his journeys. Alexander's posthumous role in identity formation remains particularly fascinating. Modern Greeks claim him as national hero, despite his ambiguous relationship with classical Greek city-states. The controversy between Greece and North Macedonia over naming rights reflects the potent symbolic power still attached to Alexandrian heritage. In Afghanistan, some tribes claim descent from his armies, while Iranian nationalists have attempted to reclaim him as part Persian through his marriage to Roxana. These competing claims demonstrate how historical figures can become powerful resources in modern identity construction. Perhaps most profound is Alexander's legacy as perpetual reference point for human possibility and limitation. His life raises enduring questions about the nature of ambition, the costs of greatness, and the tension between individual brilliance and sustainable institutions. His achievements demonstrated what extraordinary human will could accomplish, while his empire's rapid disintegration after his death revealed the limitations of even the most remarkable individual life without supporting structures. The psychological dimension of Alexander's legacy extends beyond leadership studies to fundamental questions about human desire. His reported weeping upon learning there were no more worlds to conquer captures a universal aspect of human experience, the insatiability of ambition and the melancholy that can accompany even the greatest success. This Alexander becomes a symbol not merely of conquest, but of the human condition itself, perpetually seeking meaning through achievement, yet never finding permanent satisfaction. For modern observers, Alexander's legacy also raises ethical questions about historical judgment across vast cultural and temporal divides. How should contemporary standards inform our assessment of a figure who operated within radically different moral frameworks? The destruction of Thebes, the mass crucifixions after Tyre's fall, and the slaughter of tribes that resisted in Central Asia and India represent atrocities by modern standards, yet occurred within a historical context where such actions followed established patterns of ancient warfare. Environmental historians have recently identified another dimension of Alexander's legacy: his campaign's ecological impact through urbanization, agricultural change, and facilitation of long-distance trade in biological materials. The spread of Greek farming techniques, introduction of new crops to regions along his route, and establishment of cities requiring intensive resource extraction, collectively altered landscapes from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. These changes, though gradual and less dramatic than military conquests, may represent among his most enduring material legacies. Educational approaches to Alexander revealed changing historiographical values across generations. 19th century textbooks often presented him unambiguously as civilization's agent, spreading Hellenic light among Eastern darkness. Later treatments emphasized cultural imperialism and the suffering of conquered peoples. Contemporary approaches typically seek more balanced assessment, acknowledging both the violence inherent in conquest and the genuine cultural flourishing that occurred in the Hellenistic synthesis Alexander's campaigns made possible. Ultimately, Alexander's most significant legacy may be the questions his life continues to raise, rather than any definitive answers it provides. Was he visionary unifier or brutal conqueror? Exemplar of human potential or cautionary tale about power's corruption? Agent of cultural progress or destroyer of indigenous traditions? The persistent fascination he generates suggests these questions themselves, rather than their specific answers, constitute his most valuable bequest to posterity. In asking them, we continue a conversation about power, purpose, and human possibility that has continued uninterrupted since Alexander himself rode east from Macedonia over 2 millennia ago. The remarkable life of the Macedonian king unfolds across history like a brilliant meteor, brief, dazzling, and leaving the world fundamentally changed in its wake. From the rugged mountains of humble Macedonia to the distant banks of the Indus River, his journey reshaped not only political boundaries, but the very conception of human potential and the interconnectedness of civilizations once thought entirely separate. The empire forged during his campaigns did not outlive its creator. Within a generation, the vast territories unified under one banner, fractured into rival kingdoms ruled by former generals. The political cohesion established through conquest proved fleeting, an edifice built on the force of one extraordinary will, which collapsed without its center. Yet from the ashes of that impermanent structure rose something deeper and more enduring, a cultural synthesis that would influence Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilization for centuries. This new Hellenistic world, neither purely Greek nor traditionally Eastern, was a creative fusion of philosophies, sciences, and aesthetics. Greek reason encountered Persian stargazing and Indian healing, producing insights impossible within the confines of isolated traditions. Artists drew on multiple styles to craft something new, and cities from Alexandria to Ai-Khanoum became vibrant melting pots of intellectual exchange and spiritual exploration. Perhaps most fascinating is how different cultures have interpreted his legacy. To the Greeks, he remained the hero who avenged past wrongs and spread their civilization to the ends of the earth. Persian accounts saw him first as a destroyer, later reframed as a figure woven into their own imperial tapestry. Indian chronicles offered little acknowledgement, while Islamic tradition cast him as Dhul-Qarnayn, a righteous ruler mentioned in the Quran. In medieval Europe and the Islamic world, he evolved into a legendary archetype, an almost mythic being representing ambition, divinity, and destiny. These varied portrayals reflect not inconsistency, but richness. This figure endures not as one man, but many, a brilliant tactician, visionary monarch, reckless youth, calculating strategist, cultural bridge builder, and relentless conqueror. No single lens captures the contradictions embedded in his 32 years. Each generation finds in him a mirror, one that reflects its hopes, fears, and struggles with the nature of power. For modern audiences, his legacy serves as both inspiration and cautionary tale. His feats demonstrate what vision, ambition, and ingenuity can achieve when aligned with opportunity. But his story also underscores the fragility of even the greatest human projects. the challenge of creating systems that outlast their creator, the physical toll of boundless exertion, and the psychological strain of unrestrained authority. As the tale draws to a close, we are left to ponder the impermanence of empires and the surprising permanence of cultural influence. The institutions he built crumbled within years, yet the intellectual and artistic dialogues sparked by his conquests continued for centuries, shaping the contours of Western thought, Islamic philosophy, and indirectly the modern global imagination. In the end, his truest legacy may lie not in territory claimed, but in the boundaries of thought and identity he helped dissolve. The young prince, who once set out to eclipse his father's triumphs, could never have foreseen just how deeply he would transform the world. From the long vantage of history, we can recognize both the brilliance of his era and its place in humanity's larger narrative, celebrating not a demigod, but a man whose extraordinary life continues to illuminate both our potential and our limitations.